so let's start off strong and strange. Number 10, the night the moon split. This one was actually admittedly new to me, so I'm kind of bummed I didn't get to learn about it sooner. So, Jack B. Hartung, a geophysicist at the State University of New York, rediscovered this crazy document in 1976. A monk named Gervasio, chronicler of the Abbey of Christ Church in Canterbury, on June 18th of 1178 AD, he and 5 others saw the moon get attacked? It's hard to describe, so to quote from him, the upper horn of the bright new crescent moon suddenly split in two. From the midpoint of this division, a flaming torch sprang up, spewing out fire, hot coals, and sparks. The body of the moon, which was below, writhed and throbbed like a wounded snake. His documentation says this reoccurred another 12 times consecutively, and then after it finished, the celestial body turned blackish. Gervasio also reported they are prepared to stake their honor on the oath that they have made no addition or falsification in the above narrative in regards to the witness statements. What exactly was it that the monk saw that night in the sky in 1178? Could it have been the impact of an asteroid hitting the moon's surface, or a meteorite entering the Earth's atmosphere at just the right moment? A shared delusion is a pretty hard pitch, but maybe these priests were on a group trip in more than one way. Harding suggested that this account is consistent with the location and age of the Giordano Bruno, the youngest crater of its size or larger on the moon. The impact would have launched 10 million tons of ejecta into the Earth's atmosphere in the following week, yet no vigilant 12th century skywatcher reported such a storm, so it's just a mystery now. Some days I feel like I could sleep for endless hours, heck, today was one of them, but I don't think I could ever power down for as long as the 7 sleepers of Eupheus, which are number 9 in the countdown. So this is one of those stories with 100 different versions, and nobody knows which one is the OG or who exactly started it. Generally, its plot structure is consistent. It's the 3rd century AD, and the Roman Emperor Decius is a big fan of the Roman gods and wants the Christians out of his region. So naturally, it's persecution time, because like kindergartners, why use your words when you can use your fists? In Eupheus, which was one of the great cities of the ancient world, now located in modern-day Turkey, 7 young Christian men didn't want to revert back to the Roman gods, and seeing the alternative of that is playing the brutal death lottery, the 7 fled to a local cave together. Unfortunately, they get discovered, and the Roman soldiers just seal the grotto with them inside. Knowing that there was no hope and probably a really uncomfortable talk about food hierarchy coming soon, they dogpiled together and went to sleep. The next thing they knew, daylight was shining on them, and they woke up to the stones being moved by a local who was nabbing the rocks for building materials. One of the group, thinking it might be safe to come out now, heads into Eupheus to get some bread for the rest, but the baker was tripping out over the coins he was trying to use to pay with. They were ancient, and the man soon discovers he and his 6 friends had been asleep for 156 years. However, some versions of the story say even longer. Obviously, the story isn't logically possible, but we can argue there's some mystery in the origins of it and its creator, especially since it remained in circulation for over 200 years, with versions of the story in 9 medieval languages and 200 medieval manuscripts. Here's a weird one for you. Number 8, the Gothic cathedral construction. That's right, those big pretty B words, they are a mystery to us. In our face mystery. Gothic cathedrals such as Notre Dame de Paris and Chartres Cathedral are renowned for being awe-inspiring, but they also take a village and a lot of science and architecture accomplishments that quite literally should not and could not be possible to be done in that period to build. Yet here they are, being built, being done. Would you look at that? So Notre Dame is a fantastic example, as its construction began in 1160, but it wasn't completed for a near century. It took the near destruction and the ongoing restoration project to allow a team of archaeologists to finally discover how it was built and things like the iron reinforcements. The construction of these massive structures posed significant engineering challenges for medieval builders. The mystery lies in the precise techniques and tools used to create such masterpieces without the aid of modern technology. How were these colossal cathedrals designed and built? The intricate details and the precisions of their construction continue to baffle experts and inspire wonder. More than 200 scientists are among the team of specialists working on restoring Notre Dame, with the project due to be completed by the end of 2024. Okay, so now let's do a classic. One of the many weird, indecipherable books to come from the medieval period is the Codex gigas, next up as number 7. In July of 1648, during the final Duke Downs of the 30 Years' War, the Swedish army was looting the city of Prague. Discovered and stolen alongside many treasures was a book called the Codex Gigas, which today is famous as the largest medieval book in the whole world, but also its contents have earned it the fun and lighthearted nickname, the Devil's Bible, a name it earned from a full depiction of the devil in a classic medieval style. So, the Devil's Bible contains 310 pages of vellum from 160 donkeys. However, at one point it did contain 320 pages before someone cut out the last 10 from the book. That's one of the mysteries. This codex was meant to be exactly that. That's why it contains a Christian Bible in its entirety, the Jewish War, the Jewish Antiquities by Flavius Josephus, an encyclopedia by St. Isidore of Seville, and the Chronicle of Bohemia written by a Bohemian monk named Cosmas. There's also some extra stuff thrown in on medical practices, penitence, spells, exorcism. There are several myths surrounding the creation of the Devil's Bible, and they all involve, would you have guessed it, the devil. One of the most famous myths is that the 13th century monk who wrote it supposedly made a pact with the devil to complete it in a single night. The mystery lies really in the sheer size of the book, its origin, and the incredible feat of its creation if it really was made in just one day. Okay, so on to number 6. How'd Eddie go? Edward II was born in 1284 as the 4th son of Edward I and Eleanor Castile. His 3 elder brothers all died, and he became his father's heir and the first English prince to be named Prince of Wales. So, Edward is prolific for 3 things: fighting with nobility, having speculated boyfriends, and vanishing. Those first 2 things combined caused some issues, such as Piers Gaveston, who is exiled thrice from the kingdom on demand of the barons, who would not comply with any political motions until it was done. Someone kills Piers so that favoritism from the king ends, but the rest of Edward II's reign was marked by further disputes and battles with his barons, as well as another unpopular friendship with a man called Hugh Despenser. He and his wife Isabella just straight up fall out as a result, and that causes her to run off to France to find a man that actually wants to better. And that would of course be an English rebel named Roger Mortimer. So these two lure Isabella and Edward's son, also named Edward, over to France as well, and then she and Roger start hatching some plans to invade England, while Edward II is playing house with Hugh. So on the 24th of September 1326, Queen Isabella and Mortimer began their invasion, and on the 16th of November, Edward II had been captured and sent to Kenilworth, a fortress owned by the Earl of Lancaster where he was imprisoned. He's forced to abdicate for his son in January of 1327, and after that, poof, Edward II vanishes. Some say reports several months later leaked that he was put to death by the new regime, but some accounts say that he was able to escape his imprisonment and went on to be a monk. There are even reports that his son, Edward III, met a man who claimed to be his father living in Antwerp. A rather big mystery to date is number 5, the empty lands. Although the Norse had settled in Greenland for over 400 years, their colony was at most only a few thousand people. By the later Middle Ages, the colony was in decline, and it seemed that the last visitor to Greenland came in 1420. Then nothing. The people seemingly dropped off the face of the earth. No evidence of them ever leaving, but no evidence of them remaining. During the mid-10th century, Norse settlers arrived on the island of Greenland in the late 980s, which is named by Eric the Red, the king of I hope they judge a book by its cover, obviously, since its title was a strategic moniker intended to make the cold, desolate location sound more appealing and gain immigrants. The height of the Viking presence saw thousands of Norse men and women living there. They were farmers and hunters, seizing upon the availability of walrus tusks to succeed in the ivory trade. But as described by the mid-14th century, there's a massive decline. It was widely thought that the Norse left Greenland due to changes in climate. Warmer weather not only influenced survival on the island, but also made travel by sea more difficult. Some researchers believe that the Vikings starved to death. Perhaps they couldn't adapt to their new surroundings. What happened to its remaining residents? Did they get killed off in a plague, or by battling the neighboring Inuit, or did they just really subtly leave? Another powerful man went missing without a trace, leaving us to wonder, where's Al-Hakim, number 4? Except this powerful man is remembered as quite literally the Mad Caliph. From the year 996 to 1021, Al-Hakim bi Amir Allah ruled Egypt and parts of North Africa and the Near East in a wildly erratic and strict manner, especially towards religious minorities. His restrictions were pretty intense, forcing the people of Cairo to work overnight, banning women's faces being in public, outlawing rapes, and then also the catching and eating of fish without scales, and oh, don't forget, chess became illegal. Then there are the accounts of him killing his cousins and family, the Jews, the Christians, even his own soldiers. Anyways, you got an idea of the guy. So one night, February of 1021, at the age of 36, Al-Hakim left for one of his journeys to the hills outside of Cairo, where he enjoyed meditating, because even the deranged need some peace. But he never returned. A search only found his donkey and blood-stained garments. No one's ever discovered if he was killed, engineered his own disappearance, or was injured and then became lost. Another famous mystery is that of Genghis Khan's grave, number 3. Founder of the largest contiguous dynasty to have ever existed, you'd think this guy would have a spectacular ornate tomb, like a meeting ground of the pomp and flair in the terracotta soldiers mixed with King Tut's treasury. However, if Genghis Khan does, it's a complete mystery to us. Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes, led fierce conquests, and established functional meritocracy before his passing in 1227. While the exact cause of Genghis Khan's demise is already unknown, on top of that, so is his final resting place, which modern historians believe was intentionally hidden. One historical account stated he was buried right where he fell, but without any temple or marker. Another theory is that he was given a proper burial and tomb, and the soldiers comprising of his funeral party killed everyone they saw along the way, and once the leader's body was in the ground, obscured the site to maintain secrecy. That was said to be perhaps under a river. There's a strong theory that Genghis Khan and a handful of his descendants were buried under a mound at the top of his favorite mountain and one he declared sacred, Burkum Kaldun. It's where he was said to take shelter after having run away as a child. To this day, you need special permission by the government to even get close to the mountain. But in the words of one Mongolian resident named Ulian, if they wanted us to find it, they would have left us a sign. And speaking of the Huns, for number 2, I want to talk about a fave mystery of mine, Pope Leo and Attilia's chat. What did they talk about? I want to know so bad. I am this close to breaking in the Vatican myself, guys. So if you don't know, Attila, the son of Genghis and one of the inheritors of the empire, was just absolutely taking over the world in the 5th century territory at a time. And he had finally made his way to Rome in 452, and more specifically, the Vatican. Naturally, the people of Rome are terrified. They knew the fierce reputation of Genghis's empire, aka they knew they were screwed. And then the emperor knew he had one shot to try and dissuade the inevitable doomsday. So he crossed fingers, asked the creator for a miracle, and sent 3 people to go meet Attila. Gennadius Avenius, one of the consuls of 450, Memmius Emilius Trigetius, the former urban prefect, and Leo I, the pope, to do the real big boy talking. Leo, Grenadus, and Memmius ride out and meet Attila, but it's Leo and Attila who privately converse. Even if there's a possibility that Leo I documented the conversation, the manuscripts hide in the Vatican archives and would not be open to the public. So whatever it was that he said, it made Attila look away, ponder, nod his head, and go, alright, I'll dip. And just like that, the Huns withdrew. I want to know so bad what it was. Did Leo say, here's a big box of gold and a map to Constantinople? Or was it like you're trying to subtly tell someone with your eyes not to apply at your terrible minimum wage fast food job, and you're like, get out of here, man. You don't actually want this. What did Leo do? Alright, and last but far from least, since it's number 1, we'll have you asking, is that a giant? So, fun fact, it was actually just 2 years ago in 2021 that researchers managed to definitively date what's called the Cerny Abbas giant, an 180-foot tall chalk and stone carving in Dorset, England. Drawn between 700 and 1100, the giant was previously believed to be created in prehistoric or ancient Britain, or during the post-medieval era. Instead, it's smack dab in the middle of medieval ages. So, the period between 700 and 1100 is Anglo-Saxon, but there's still no agreement about the purpose of such a large hill figure, especially one that looks the way it does. I know it'll be blurred on screen for you guys, but a quick Google Images search in another tab, you'll see exactly what I mean. The exact time frame for the club-wielding, well-endowed figure's creation was welcome, albeit surprising finding. What remains unclear, however, is who drew it and why. Cerny Abbey was founded in 987 AD, and some sources think the abbey was set up to be a convert for the locals from the worship of an early Anglo-Saxon god known as Heel or Heelith. Local legends also say it could be an outline drawing of an actual giant. No matter what theory you decide upon, Cerny Abbas giant has always been somewhat understandably associated with fertility. Especially during the Victorian era, visiting the site was believed to alleviate issues with infertility, like a strange P-word pilgrimage. First up, since we've heard a decent recent bit about knights before. Let's start with training day, or days, well, years. The joke still landed, whatever. Training for knights began around age 7, and it would take an average of 14 years before they were ready to battle. Essentially like going to middle and high school today. And like the school system, you moved up through the levels. Potential knights started as pages, who essentially acted as an assistant or servant to their assigned lord. Most of the training for pages began practicing with dull weapons, learning to master riding a horse, take part in hunts, and otherwise do menial tasks. At 14, pages would become squires, assuming they were still in good physical health and not a raging socio or psychopath. According to medieval Britain, once a page became a squire, he had to master the 7 points of agilities, which was just a really long list of sporting events. So things like shooting, fencing, wrestling, riding horses, swimming and diving, climbing, long jumping, tournaments, sports like jousting, and dancing. Okay, so that's more than 7 points of agilities, and dancing was in there, so let's just agree that medieval logic was a bit strange and their math skills were bad, and we can move on. After approximately 5 to 7 years of this higher training, if they survived and had mastered all the required skills, they'd usually be officially knighted, and that's usually at age 19 to 22. You weren't taught to have your own opinions, but people are people, and that's why sometimes a knight had to battle their conscience. As a knight, you were serving God. But what did that mean? A knight could go his whole life without having the clouds overhead opening up and God sticking his head through to yell specific directions at him out of everyone on earth to choose from. So he had to turn elsewhere for guidance. Okay, so what do we got here? Well, there's the priest, or you could ask the king, who by virtue was a direct mouthpiece of God, which by the way is super convenient to be packing when you want to do things like seduce courtiers or chop off people's heads. God said I could, haha. But this also means a knight is always beholden to kings and that mouthpiece of his. Whether or not the orders agreed with the knight's conscience, the orders came from God and he was dedicated to that God. So what happened to knights who disobeyed that or somehow dishonored themselves? The ones who the king hits up and said, yo, I'm gonna have your wife tonight, or go execute this blind person for bumping into me, and their response was anything other than, oh yeah man, do whatever you want. Well, a king gave the knight his spurs so he could also take them away. According to noble dynasty, when a knight who did something treasonous or cowardly, let me correct, was just accused of doing something treasonly or cowardly because there didn't have to be proof, he got publicly stripped of knighthood in a formal ceremony, then executed. And seeing as being a knight meant that could happen at any second, X marks the plot. There must have been those knights with existentialism, the ones who laid up at night wondering if all the infidel killing and pervy chivalry and pillaging and holy calling stuff, what if it's almost but not enough to get you into heaven? Which means you could do pretty much everything right as a knight and still spend sleepless nights worrying that you wouldn't make it past the pearly gates. They were a super religious lot after all. In anticipation of solving this problem, a lot of knights, well, those who made it past their youth anyway, would often join a military order because membership usually came with a plot in a church graveyard. And seeing as they believed even people who were completely without sin could not be guaranteed a place in heaven unless they were buried in a certain kind of dirt, that's better than a pension. And no, not any dirt would do. It had to be consecrated dirt of a church graveyard. According to ancient history encyclopedia, an aging knight would sometimes even enlist at the last possible second for battle, so he could be interred beneath a lovely stone effigy in church forever without needing to do or spend any time doing boring churchy stuff. Our world loves class divide, and that's no different back then, when it sucked to be a poor knight. On that note, contrary to popular belief, not all knights were wealthy with castles and serfs and all that bougie middle-age luxury. In fact, some weren't even landowners at all, and the rank of knight was more or less something that made one a minor noble, like your auntie on city council. Though, of course, many among the knighted held higher positions in nobility separate from their knightly status. This is to do with knighthood becoming a nepo baby industry. The lowest class of these knights might even live in their lord's homes, serving more or less as bodyguards, security, occasionally law enforcement, and sometimes judges, mediating local disputes. In essence, their day-to-day was a bit of a mashup between soldier and civil law enforcement. It's like those people you met who wanted to become a cop for the fast action and the pew-pew and the speed chases, then learn it's 80% paperwork and painfully slow regiment. As you might imagine, lower ranked and poorer knights love tournaments for a chance to gain prestige, practice their skills, and the chance to acquire additional wealth via prizes and ransoms and the like. So, tournaments is next on our list, because they were essentially medieval mud melees. Since knights started at not-nosed kids, it was easy to build the ideology of tournaments as fun and exciting into them. The foundation of competitiveness. In the 13th century, tournaments were particularly bloody and death was not uncommon. Initially, the games and tournaments were a little more than massive melees, usually including real sharpened weapons. There were no rules, and tensions were made intensely high because often they'd group the knights by nation or clan, then pit them against each other that way. Call whoever had that idea Taylor Swift because they wanted bad blood. That said, the general point, unlike real battle, was not to intentionally kill your opponent, but just to knock them off their horse, steal their armor and horse, and take them prisoner until the tourney is over. That being said, dull weapons weren't introduced into tournaments for hundreds of years, and they also used lances to launch each other off of horses at full speed, so realistically death is inevitable. One notable tournament took place in 1274 when King Edward I was pitted against the Count of Chalons. As the king and the count battled it out, dozens of soldiers from each side got involved and lost their lives. And these tournaments often took up whole villages. This is because they weren't much different from actual battle, so knights could take off and hide in a peasant's house from the opposing team, which was often then ransacked and burnt. Essentially, being a medieval peasant was like living in Avengers Universe New York, where at any second your whole house could be obliterated in a blink and you miss it style by a group of battling morons. Losing your life can suck, but so can losing your gear, because knights buy their own armor. The biggest barrier to entry for those who are peasants or serf turned knight was the absurdly high cost of equipment. Remember, this was centuries before governments decided to arm their troops for combat. You want to be blessed by the divine right to be controlled by me, the king, your whole life and have no freedom, property, life, money, individualism of your own, only to die stupidly in a field somewhere? Well, you also need to buy your own armor. Being a knight was a fat ripoff. Mostly you were paid in land ownership, or sometimes just by the glory of your lord. And that's because the system benefited noblemen who grew up in it, not much different from how things work nowadays. So any armor or weapons you needed had to be purchased on the side. With money, you were never given. It's no problem for the knights of noble birth, but other knights would have to work the land and sell goods just to earn enough. Yes, it is also a tin can, and it's one size only. Have fun rebuying pieces when weight fluctuates. One outlier though is new research and digital recreations show that knights were actually able to tumble, climb, chop wood, jump on horses, and run quite easily all in armor. So if you're scared of never being able to fit in again, never get out of it. Not like they washed much anyways. And while it can keep you safe, it can put a target on your back too. Held for ransom is next. And if you've ever watched a movie such as Gladiator, Braveheart, 300, Troy, to name a few, then you may recall that some dudes always wore special armor during battle, and some wore none. If you were rich enough or important enough, you could have the best of the best armor, made of the strongest but lightest materials to gain a defensive edge on the battlefield, all at the low price of your daddy's money. And it wasn't exclusive to any kingdom, so that means in one moment for everyone battling one another, knights realized that if they saw opponents in incredibly strong or elaborate armor, not to kill that guy, but keep him. Captured instead, a ransom could be demanded for a nobleman knight, because only well-off knights wore such good armor, so that's what you get for flashing your stack, I guess. Worst case Ontario, if the ransom doesn't work out and none of your boys are as sizes 12 as 88s in tin seam, you can melt them down for some pieces of your own. Hey, what sucked more than the medieval knight? Being married to one. Like so many of the sickest jobs in history, being a knight was exclusively reserved for the owners of a ding-a-ling. Their wives were expected to sit at home, not learning to kill people with a broadsword or pile driving her buddies into a pile of dung, their bloodlust going offensively unsatiated. Unless their husband died like a moron, that is. In that case, in a very un-Middle Ages twist, women were expected to fulfill all their husband's knightly duties. This included protecting their new lord and making sure his land didn't fall into disrepair. Only women didn't get any of the cool stuff that came with it, like respect or equality or acknowledgement by history. They got armor though, which is pretty sick. Unsurprisingly, the wives seldom waited for their husbands to get gored by a lance before getting all up in the business of running the show. He could literally drop at any time, so homegirl had to be ready. This resulted in knight wives actually being significantly more skilled and diplomatically inclined than their husbands. The duties generally expected of a knight's wife included everything from organizing the defenses of their state to arranging marriages for their servants. This was on top of being at beck and call for their husbands 24 hours a day. I wonder how many of these men really met their ends of their own accord, and how many met their end when she didn't need him anymore. It has the effect Taco Bell has on the average 21st century person. Dentistry. Dentistry is a disease caused by tainted tainted food and drink, causing intestinal inflammation leading to excessively frequent and uncontrollable diarrhea to the point of death. So yeah, Taco Bell. Generally, no one was safe. A fact 15th century Italian polymath Girolamo Savonarola made clear when he observed that dentistry affected not only in the same house, but in the entire locale, and moving from a child of 10 or 15 to a sexagenarian. Savonarola himself came down with the disease in 1495. Now this included knights. Battling knights. On English invasion of France, King Henry II had brought a well-trained and disciplined army who were riddled with this disease. The tough-tested veterans could handle the fever and the fatigue, but the constant loss of bowel control presented a massive, stinky problem on the eve of an already ominous battle. So, the English set up their position on one side of a narrow field, which lay between two forested areas. The narrow approach allowed the limited number of men-at-arms to stretch across the front, while the archers took stationary positions on the flanks angled inward with a row of protective stakes in front. Thanks to their stationary positions, the archers suffering from dentistry simply dropped their pants and shot their arrows. They also dipped their arrows in it to add insult to injury as the world's worst psychological and bio-warfare duo. I mean, can you imagine an arrow covered in that flying at you? Yeah, they won. By a lot. And topping our list is a reminder that our mental well-being is not solely a thing of the present. It's PTSD. From crime statistics and letters of pardons, historians can see that people in the Middle Ages were no more violent than we are today. And yes, they exercised it in its most extreme forms, but this violence was not through nature nor culture, rather simple direction. Whilst following their orders, those battle experiences could leave them with a very serious case of PTSD. This is backed up by a book that was actually written by a knight who lived in the first half of the 14th century. His name was Giroffe de Charny, and he was one of the most respected knights of his age. The book about the life of a knight actually includes the psychological consequences. These symptoms ring true of PTSD. In his book, de Charny advises knights on how to relate to the fact that they must kill people when they are at war, how to mentally endure the hardships knights face, poor sleep, hunger, emotional numbness, loneliness, and a feeling that even nature is going against them. Modern military psychology enables us to read medieval texts like these, or ones of Egypt or Greek battles and the Mongol spread, all in a new way, giving us insight into the perception of violence in the Middle Ages in the general population. In history, we've had a horrible habit of misinterpreting. Easy mistake as inflection doesn't appear on paper or stone tablets. Previously, medieval texts were read as worshipping heroes and glorifying violence, but in the light of modern military psychology, we can see the mental cost to knights and of their participation in the gruesome and extreme violent wars in the Middle Ages.
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Pope Gregory IX. Pope Gregory IX was the Bishop of Rome and the ruler of the Papal States from 1227 until his passing in 1241. The Papal States were a series of territories in the Italian peninsula that were under direct rule of the Pope from the 8th century all the way to 1870. It turns out that Pope Gregory IX had a very strange hatred for cats. He said that black cats were actually instruments of Satan, which seems a little extreme, but then he actually went as far as to order that they be exterminated throughout Europe, which is definitely a little extreme. With this order, the Pope's followers had to oblige, and there was a drastic reduction in the cat population. But of course, this caused a disturbance to the ecosystem, and the time and the consequence of that became very evident. Because of the decline of cats, there was a sudden increase in the amount of rats, most of which may have been carrying the plague. There are a lot of historians who would argue that this war on cats may have had a huge effect on the severity of the Black Plague. That is of course speculation, as it's pretty difficult to pinpoint who could be at fault for something like that, but it certainly is a very interesting point. This all really does, however, bring me to my next point. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Black Death. I'm sure we've all heard of the Black Death at some point or another. I mean, how could we possibly ever stop talking about something like that? During the 1340s, there was an outbreak of the bubonic plague that spread rapidly throughout Europe and Asia. It was called the Black Plague because of the fact that this illness would cause people's lymph nodes to become swollen and black. The Black Death was absolutely terrible, and it caused a lot of agony for those who had to go through it. Symptoms included things like severe body aches, fever, vomiting, and eventual death in most cases. There was no cure for the plague, so it just continued to spread. In the end, the Black Death took the lives of hundreds of millions of people. We now all know firsthand what it is like to live through a pandemic, and I certainly wouldn't sign up to do it again anytime soon, so I'm most definitely sure the times of the Black Death were some of the worst times in history. Apparently, it is said that if you lived in the 1340s, there was basically a 50-50 chance that you'd survive the Black Death. And then on top of that, there's all of the other horrifying ways to die that the medieval times held. All in all, I'm kinda shocked that we're still here today. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Mongol invasion. Being in China during the Mongol invasion certainly was a terrifying time. I'm sure a lot of us here have heard at least some of the stories surrounding Genghis Khan, but if you haven't, let's just say that being on his bad side certainly wasn't a good thing for you. In 1205, when the Mongol invasion in China began, it was the regular citizens of China who paid the ultimate price. What was started by Genghis Khan was carried on by his son and then his grandson, which ultimately led to a 74-year-long campaign that was filled with brutality and destruction. Cities and towns were destroyed, empires were brought down, and millions of completely innocent people lost their lives. It is believed that this invasion took the lives of enough people to cut the population in half from 120 million before to just 60 million after. Anyone living in China at this time would have had to live in absolute fear of being killed for something that you really had nothing to do with. That would be awful and absolutely terrifying. In our number 7 spot today, we have Pope Formosus and Pope Stephen VI. Pope Formosus was the ruler of the Papal States from October 6th, 891 until he passed away on April 4th, 896. After his passing, Pope Boniface VI took his place as ruler for just a few weeks before he also passed away, which then left Pope Stephen VI as the ruler from then on until his death. After this whirlwind April of 1896, things got even weirder. Before his passing, Pope Formosus had sided with Arnulf of Carinthia against Lambert of Spoleto, which was definitely not okay with Pope Stephen VI. So, once Pope Stephen VI gets to the place of being the ruler, he gets the people to exhume the body of Pope Formosus so that he can put him on trial. I feel like this is very gross and very unnecessary, but this really is the type of stuff that went on in the 800s. They propped the body up for trial and had a deacon answer questions for him since he obviously was unable to do that himself. They ended up finding the corpse guilty, which seems a little unfair, and they actually went as far as to strip the body of its sacred vestments, took 3 fingers from the right hand as they were the blessing fingers. They dressed the body in regular people clothes instead of the clothing a pope would be buried in, and then they reburied the body. If this poor man's body hadn't been through enough, it was later re-exhumed again and thrown into the river. If this story wasn't already wild enough, this whole debacle is actually what would later end up getting Pope Stephen imprisoned and then killed. Alright, so I guess the other pope had his justice in the end. I don't know, man. In our number 6 spot today, we have King Charles VI. King Charles VI started off his reign by being very well loved and respected, but as time went on over his 4 decades of ruling, he ended up being known as Charles the Mad. His erratic behavior had him hacking up nights, imagining that he was St. George, and he would also have bouts of amnesia where he would be able to recognize some people, but not his wife and children. This is all very strange and of course quite sad, as he was obviously exhibiting signs of extreme mental illness, but one of the strangest symptoms was him believing that he was made of glass. He was terribly frightened of falling or being jostled too hard, and he would actually insert iron rods into his clothing to try and keep himself from shattering. But then he would also apparently run wild at top speeds throughout the halls of the castle or the streets, which would obviously mean that he was completely abandoning his fear of fragility. It apparently got so bad that he had to be held inside with the entrances blocked off. Sadly, he continued on this path until he passed away in 1422. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Italian Renaissance dark side. Just at the tail end of the years of the medieval period, as we transitioned into the Renaissance period, began the Italian Renaissance. When we think of the Italian Renaissance period, it is known for the development and the rebirth that it caused, which makes a lot of sense considering the word Renaissance means rebirth. But there is one less glamorous and slightly frightening side to this period that isn't always spoken about. Sailors who had been returning from the New World at this point brought something less than lovely back with them, and that was syphilis, which spread through an entire French army. After this, the troops brought what was called the Great Pox to the rest of Europe. Since there was no penicillin back then, the disease spread rapidly and the symptoms were pretty gruesome. It would often happen that the person who had fallen ill would have the skin on their faces essentially be rotting away, which would leave large ulcers. Sometimes people's noses or lips would be pretty much gone, and it happened often that people would very sadly pass away from the disease. So basically, what we think of as a really beautiful time in Europe was both world-changing but also very scary and, like, I don't know, kinda close to a zombie apocalypse. In our number 4 spot today we have William the Conqueror. In 1087, William the Conqueror decided to take on an all-alcohol diet. This is because he was suffering from extreme obesity and was struggling because of that fact. Because of this, he told his staff that he would only drink wine until his weight went down, but he ended up passing away less than a year later, and most of us are told that obviously this was because of the wine-only diet. That's actually not true. In an astonishing turn of events, this wine-only diet actually worked. Shortly after beginning his diet, he was able to ride his horse again, which was one of the main reasons he started the diet in the first place, as he was previously too heavy for the horse to carry. He actually died after falling from his horse during an expedition, which was completely unrelated to either his weight or his diet. It's entirely possible that had he not gone on this diet, he would have never ridden his horse and maybe would have lived longer? Truthfully, who knows? But I suppose in a very roundabout way, he did still kind of die from his wine-only diet. In our number 3 spot today we have Olga of Kiev. Olga of Kiev became queen regent in 945 CE after her husband was killed, and during the time her son was too young to rule just yet. Olga knew that once her son was old enough to be crowned king, her power would be taken away, so she needed to see her wishes carried out before that happened. Her wishes included the capturing and killing of those who took the life of her husband, which was carried out by using scalding hot water. Yeah. Don't even want to imagine what that would have been like. Don't kill the king, I guess. Historically, it really doesn't seem to work out well. Apparently, in doing this, however, Olga developed a bit of a bloodthirst, and she would not rest until everyone associated with the people who killed her husband were all eliminated. It seemed like if you even looked in the wrong direction or breathed in the vicinity of someone who had something to do with the king's slaying, you could kiss your own life goodbye. Olga took hundreds of people out of the tribe that the killers were from. She devised a plan to bury the tribe leaders alive, and she even came up with a plan to set fire to their entire village. It is said that Olga may have locked the tribe's leaders in a bathhouse and burned it down, but we don't know for sure. All we do know is that she definitely was not okay. In our number 2 spot today we have Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa was a deputy to the ruler of the Mali Empire, but when the ruler went missing while on a sea voyage to find the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, Mansa Musa became the ruler in 1312. During his rule, European nations were really struggling due to civil wars and a lack of resources, but the Mali Empire was flourishing because of their abundance of resources like gold and salt. Under his rule, the empire grew to take up a large portion of West Africa as he conquered 24 cities and their surrounding districts. At this time, Mali was one of the top producers of gold in the entire world, which left Mansa Musa as one of the wealthiest historical figures ever. One of the most well-known events during his rule was the pilgrimage to Mecca. This journey took place from 1324 to 1325 and spanned an estimated 4,000 miles, and it was the first time people outside of the empire saw just how wealthy he was. He traveled with 60,000 of his men, all wearing Persian silk, along with 12,000 slaves who each carried 4 pounds of gold bars, and he also brought heralds who had golden staffs, along with a bunch of camels and horses. This pilgrimage had a profound effect on Egypt as this huge group of people passed through. From the markets in Cairo to the royals to the impoverished people that crossed their path, Musa left Cairo littered with so much gold that it depreciated the value of the metal in Egypt, and it took decades for them to recover. In our number 1 spot today we have St. Marcellus's flood. This was actually a very serious extratropical cyclone that swept through around January 16th, 1362. This cyclone eerily matched up with the new moon, and it spanned through the British British Isles, the Netherlands, northern Germany, and Denmark. Here's the thing, this storm not only lined up with the moon, but also peaked on the feast day of Saint Marcellus, which is the reason it got its name, but usually people refer to this one as the second, because there is another. The first Saint Marcellus flood took the lives of 36,000 people as it swept through the northern Netherlands in 1219. The second flood, however, while no one is sure the exact numbers, it is estimated that at least 250,000 people lost their lives. While there have been plenty of devastating floods in history, this one is said to be blamed on Atlantic gales, and that this event goes hand in hand with the Great Wind of 1362.
Slander is number 10. Imagine seeing some random dude in the market square holding his nose and shouting about how he was a liar. Honestly, wasn't weird under the Norman law from 1066 to 1154. If you committed the act of slander, on top of paying damages to those whose reputation you may have affected, you also had to do the holding of the nose. This law was enacted by Pouty, first king of Norman, who had spent his whole life on the throne being called William the Bastard for his parents' unmarried status. In return, he exacted this silly law that required the slanderer to stand in the center of town, as previously described, holding their nose and shouting about their lies. Public humiliation has long since been an effective means of preventing crime, and just about anything. Number 9 is Jenny Craiging it. Edward III of England was so tired of his royal court nobility being heavier set that he made an entire law about it. In 1336, the new law stated obesity made people not able to aid themselves nor their liege lord in times of need. Edward mandated a maximum belt size and also, if you watched part 1, implemented food restrictions, banning more than 2 courses with the exception of holy days. Edward even defined soup as a separate course to prevent people from calling that a sauce or a condiment. This law lasted remarkably until 1856. Its main purpose in the long run had likely become beneficial economically to ensure that England's resources could be employed more effectively in the upcoming war with the French. Still, regardless, he seems like a fat-shaming dude. German purity law is number 8. Beer is Germany's national drink, and that's nothing new. The Germans have been indulging for thousands of years. Typically, beer was produced in groups and always made of pure grain, until the purity laws made by Wilhelm IV in 1516 Bavaria. Germans, and most people of the medieval and Middle Ages, didn't drink water as it was often deeply contaminated. They drank beer. The law imposed was aimed at preventing crops used to make bread from being squandered on brewing, so it stipulates that only water, barley, and hops were allowed to be used as key ingredients for beer production. At first, brewers thought this was ludicrous and unusual to decide, but turns out Wilhelm was actually onto something with this combination. This original law went on to become the core of German beer purity laws that affect German brewing to this day, which makes them the oldest regulations related to food and drink in the world. The only change to it in recent history was the adding of yeast. The Brewers Association of Germany wants the 5-century-old law governing how German beer is made to become part of the UNESCO World Heritage List. It would join the Argentinian tango, Iranian carpet weaving, and French gastronomy, among other famous traditions that are considered unique and worth protecting. Let's talk sumptuary laws with the Spanish garment laws, number 7 in the countdown. Sumptuary laws, which we discussed in part 1, are placed in to control the nobility and their consumption and displays of material goods. In the case of Spain, there are many sumptuary laws in place as early as the Spartan era. In the 13th century, for example, Siena passed a provision reducing the trains on women's dresses, which was a direct effort to curb a purely aristocratic style. In 1356, the city of Florence proclaimed it illegal for women to have buttons on their clothing without a corresponding buttonhole. And also, no one other than the king was legally permitted to wear a scarlet rain cape. Also in Florence, it was studied how sumptuary legislation around fashion served as a tool to encourage marriage in a society where excessive extravagance of men providing clothing for the women and their families exasperated the custom of very expensive dowries. If her standards were already up, you had to work harder to pay for her, I guess, and a delay in marriage did mean a dip in population. While there are ample examples of the laws themselves, similar to many other sumptuary laws, there's virtually no record of their enforcements or punishments. Oftentimes this is because nobility themselves violated their own laws that they made for themselves. Without evidence of how exactly these laws were enforced or whether they were enforced at all, it remains extremely difficult to discuss their social impact, the attitude civilians had towards them as well. Did they act accordingly so as not to face legal difficulties or the payment of fines? Who knows? Not us. So on to the next. Refusing knighthood comes in at number 6. This law was put into place in 1233. Why, you may ask? Because simply put, being a knight sucked. If you saw our last video, you may remember hearing about how insanely taxed knights knights were, but on top of that you had to pay for a ton of mandatory clothes, train incessantly, pay the king for serving him, and don't forget the custom-sized armor. You lose or gain weight, you're gonna have to pay to replace whole pieces. That's on top of the potential of dying in a battle you just don't care for. No, not many people wanted to be a knight. Roger of Dudley refused to attend his own knighting when he learned he'd have to pay for it. In response to his refusal, Henry III on the spot passed a law against refusing the knighthood. He forcefully knighted Dudley and also confiscated his land to boot. Yikes. Number 5 is the legal protection of claiming sanctuary. Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame depicts an iconic scene of Quasimodo swinging around on rope dramatically over the burning base of the Notre. Having just saved Esmeralda from an execution, he holds her aloft in the cathedral's terrace and screams out sanctuary. Sanctuary actually predates Christianity and originates far back into the 300s and existed until the 16th century. Every medieval law folded to the protections of sanctuary no matter the criminal's crime. Now, sanctuary-seeking criminals might have been required to perform penance or go into exile, but they were at least guaranteed immunity from punishment. That's right, you could literally strangle someone and then run to the church to claim sanctuary and no one could come in and harm, arrest, or remove you for punishment. Sanctuary was abolished due to the new tide of judicial law and the arguments of crime, power, and punishment. Also because people should be punished for, I don't know, maybe taking someone else's life. Originally, before Christianity, it was temples such as the ones in Greek and Rome offering the solace, and it was part of the Roman law by the end of the 4th century to have it. Christianity adopted this practice to try and persuade people to join their religion when it started. Even after the Western Roman Empire fell in 476, churches maintained their authority to protect people who had broken major secular laws. Number 4, let's meet the Yellow Ladies. Venice, Italy was an important trading post. Many people came and went, many travelers came to see the great city, but for those who had been at sea for a while, they may have wanted to see a little something else. As a result, medieval Venice was a massive red light district, enjoyed by many before their next voyages. Trying to control the number of ladies working the streets, the Venetian government mandated in 1360 that brothels must be concentrated in the market and port districts. Obviously, that just made their industry boom more since it was concentrated right where all the money came in and not dispersed, requiring men to travel farther out in convenient ways. Angry now that they weren't at least getting to capitalize off the potential tax revenue of these women, they in 1420 decided to be accommodative of their Lady of the Night friends. The Venetian government accommodated more red light districts and implemented safety means within them, as well as the law of yellow. All women of the trade were to wear shades of yellow so as to be identifiable to their clientele, so random ladies just out on a stroll who happen to be in the area don't get harassed. But also it's a little bit of that classic shame tactic of making someone unwanted easily identifiable for discrimination. Number 3 is the indigenous sumptuaries of Spain. As early as 1501, the crown warned natives who carried sword, dagger, or any other weapons that they faced confiscation and may be condemned to more punishments according to what the court sees fit. Spanish restrictions against natives developed through the 16th century. This mandate is no surprise as these items, while dangerous, complemented and enhanced men's fashions, and fashionable rapiers became integral to everyday masculine attire in Europe. To the indigenous, they had been items of necessity to carry and often seen as symbolic. For indigenous men of the elite, the right to bear arms highlighted much more than their privileged status the way that it did for the colonizer. It demonstrated colonial acknowledgement of their once dominant standing on their original lands and partially vindicated their marginalized reality even as a royal. June 8, 1685, Don Diego Garcia, an indigenous leader of what's now Guerrero, had petitioned to the Viceroy of New Spain to intervene on his behalf when this sumptuary denied him the right his parents, grandparents, and ancestors had always possessed. Garcia was one of 505 petitions submitted by 277 towns between 1575 and 1693 demanding change. In response to a perceived disregard for the law, the monarchy reissued the restriction 6 more times over the course of the next 70 years. The items requested by Don Diego Garcia reflected both indigenous and European definitions of masculinity. By focusing on European attire and the personal weapons, Garcia took advantage of the social currency imposed by Spanish colonizers. As an elite, Garcia faced decreased political power and increased marginalization under a new regime. Garments and swords provided the ability to visually assert himself in everyday life. Ultimately, petitions submitted by Garcia and his peers reflected not just a request for special status items, but an attempt to assert their belonging as an elite man in a colonial life. Number 2 is just absurd, but you can club a Swede. If they cross the frozen sea between Denmark and Sweden, What? This unusual law was imposed during the Dano-Swedish Wars of 1657 to 58. King Charles Gustav of Sweden had been planning to cross the Öresund by ship, but the freezing temperatures of January changed that plan. Frozen solid, the Swedes realized that they could simply just walk across. This completely caught the Danes off guard as no attack had been predicted until the spring, and they scrambled to compensate. Ultimately, the Danes signed the Treaty of Roskilde and yielded to the territory dispute. But ever since that day, should you see a Swede crossing over the frozen sea on foot, you are legally free to swing a big old club at him. And finally, at number 1, you either tuck it or you lose it. Medieval Wales was not playing around when it came to women being violated. If you were caught or perpetrator of this heinous crime, your options were to pay a dowry or get the little man chopped off. That's right, a violation such as this was actually considered a theft and was treated as such by the law. Should a perp pay the dowry, then legally the woman's virginity or body was restored in legal parameters. Can't or won't pay the fine? Well then, that was the end of down there for you. The reason for this, other than it being morally right, is that the fines and punishments hoped to stop families from developing harmful feuds which would damage the wider society as a whole. This was not exclusive to Wales, however. This punishment shows up in the 1750s Code of Constantinian Marvodakat in Eastern Europe. It was not unheard of for women to also simply just take the law into their hands either. In a rural area of Shropshire near the Welsh border in 1405, Isabella Grawerness and her 2 daughters ambushed her attacker in a field, tied him up, and did the dreaded snip snip, and stole his horses to boot. All 3 women were subsequently pardoned. Number 10 is sumptuary laws, which are the most common kind of medieval law. Defined as laws made for the purpose of restraining luxury or extravagance, particularly against inordinate expenditures for apparel, food, furniture, and etc. Sumptuary laws were enacted for the purpose of regulating trade, but also regulate and reinforce social hierarchies by restricting foods, clothing, and luxury items. They did this so it was easy to identify someone's social rank and privilege in the name of good old-fashioned social discrimination and class division. Bourgeoisie subjects appearing to be as wealthy or as wealthier than ruling nobility could undermine the royals' presentations as the most powerful in the land. Why, that could cause traitors and thieves and revolts. In late medieval cities, sumptuary laws were instituted as a way for nobility to limit the conspicuous consumption of everyone, most specifically the prosperous bourgeoisie, while still making it about poor commoners enough for it to slip past them while they were busy poking fun at those below them. They missed out what the royals sneakily did above them. Cowardice tax law is number 9. Medieval knights weren't always volunteered. In fact, a grand majority of many kingdoms functioned off of what was essentially a drafting of their men into the service. So it makes sense that not everyone was as passionate about the idea of sieges or holy crusades or anything that could really get them wiped out in the name of a cause that just wasn't for them. So while it could be considered a great honor to be called to battle and you wanted to shirk your duty of obligation, you technically were able to pay a scourge, aka the cowardice tax, which originated in 1100. Essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card that you paid for with your own wage. Royalty started to lean into this new tax source, and by the 13th century it had evolved into a generalized tax on the knight's land. When the scourge tax reached 300%, the result of one king's want to force those to serve him all in a total Icarus flies too close to the sun fashion, it led to the implementation of the Magna Carta, which was forced onto royalty in the times to stunt their seemingly endless control and dictatorship. Sports banning is number 8. You've heard it in some of our other medieval videos, but we'll dive more into it now. Soccer and tennis were 2 banned sports of the medieval era. Handball, club ball, which is essentially baseball, hand fighting, which we could call boxing, I guess. This law, which was made in 1485, was due to the belief that British men were losing their legendary archery skills, and also that these sports led to the sin of gambling. Obviously, the rules didn't apply to royalty really, so tennis actually became an exclusively upper-class sport for its etiquette, complex rules, and equipment requirements. Meanwhile, football, as you may already know, was absolutely brutal. There was violence leading up to deaths and serious injuries, and it was often played drunk and recklessly. In 1388, a national statute demanded that servants and laborers throughout the country stop playing football and other sports and practice archery instead, the latter being necessary for the defense of the realm. They reopened the law in 1410 to add the punishment of 6 days imprisonment for violating this rule. Even then, it was only enforced sporadically as royals were still depicted playing this game during the time of its illegality. reality. Unlike others, this law obviously is not still in place today. This older legislation concerning unlawful games was repealed in 1845. Number 7 says you're not for the streets if you do these things in them. There were a few smaller rules written in correlation with street behavior in medieval times. While it was okay to toss your feces just about anywhere, in 1839 a law imposed it be illegal to beat or shake any carpet or rug in the street. You can shake your doormat, however, but only before 8 a.m. in the morning. No carolers allowed then. It was illegal to sing songs and ballads in the street, especially if it was profane. And if you were to disturb the people by ringing doorbells or knocking on doors unexpectedly and unwantedly, you could be fined. Try enforcing that on Halloween. Meanwhile, in Scotland, it is still illegal to date to turn someone away if they knock at your door and ask to use your bathroom, no matter the time, place, age, or person. Spotted in a crowd is unfortunately number 6. Why unfortunately? Well, another fun, sumptuary law, and one of the earliest ever made in Europe, governed the appearance of minorities and social groups. Enacting laws stating specific dress codes for religions such as Jews or Muslims so that they were easily to be identified from other people. In English colonies, Muslims were told to wear a crescent-shaped brooch or badge, while Jews had to wear a similar badge, as well as a ring and a yellow cone-shaped hat. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty noticeable in a crowd. Alongside people who were Muslim or Jewish, the royals regulated laws of fashion towards people with certain diseases, those not following Christianity as a religion, orphans, and women of the night. Essentially, as you can tell, these were the unwanted peoples in the kingdom. So unfortunately, as mentioned, the point of these garbs was to make these people noticeable as social outcasts, so they may face mockery and degradation they didn't deserve for just simply existing. Number 5 is the Russian beard tax. Alright, so this technically was just outside the realm of medieval times and into middle times, but in 1698, Russian Emperor Peter the Great placed a tax on beards, hoping to force men to adopt the clean-shaven look that was common in Western Europe. Peter's goal was to shift Russia to an Eurocentric visual. His return from a 2-year escapade in Europe had him changing up the fashion trends as well, replacing their long, familiar Russian overcoats with French or Hungarian-style jackets. They were shorter in length. It meant anyone walking the streets in an old-fashioned robe was liable to have it cut short by Peter's designated fashion inspectors. The same inspectors would approach any bearded man they saw, requesting to see his beard token, a silver coin with a leafed edge, and in the center, a mustache, nose, and beard. This token was given to men who had paid their legally mandated beard tax for the year. No token provided when asked. Doesn't matter if you forgot it at home. The inspectors would cut your beard off on the spot or simply rip it out of your face. The Russian Orthodox Church, which hated Peter the Great, saw this as a downright scandal, as their teachings considered uncut facial hair a reflection of piety, seeing as man was created in the image of God, which included a beard. To shave it was a grave sin, but the church never really could stop Peter or his wily goals. This beard tax remained in place until 1772. Nowadays, these beard tokens are actually extremely rare collectibles, selling for as much as $10,000 in auctions today. Number 4 tells you don't mess with royal animals. Whether it's eating them, hunting them, or breeding them, the royals had some rules for their medieval animals. First up is how in 1332 a statute passed established the king shall have throughout the realm whales and great sturgeons taken in the sea or elsewhere within the realm. In normal English terms, what they're saying is any whales or sturgeons that were caught or washed up on crown-ruled soil, it had to first be offered to royalty before being pilfered. This law is actually still in place today, but rarely ever actualized on. However, in 2004, a fun Welsh fisherman diligently complied with the law by offering a sturgeon he had caught to the queen herself. She politely declined the offer. Interestingly enough, the provisions of this statute are expressly protected from repeal by the Wild Creatures and Forest Laws Act of 1971, as it ensures hunting these animals is minimized. Wanna offend a royal? No? Pay attention to your dog, as it's an offense to let your dog mate with any dog belonging to a royal family member. Queen Elizabeth II's corgis of modern day are included, as this law is also still valid now. There were animal laws that weren't just for royals, however. A law said that keeping a pigsty in front of your home was illegal unless it was well hidden. You also weren't allowed to be in charge or ride horses and cows if you were intoxicated, the first drunk driving regulations. And as you may know, even animals could face the judge and jury in animal court for their crimes. times. Number 3, we discuss how excessive food consumption led to restrictive laws on how food and drink were to be made, sold, and consumed. This is a great example of sumptuary laws from the point 10, where the royalty is irritated by blurring lines between them and the bourgeoisie. In 1309, Edward II criticized the outrageous and excessive multitude of meats and dishes that the nobles were eating, emulating the lifestyle of their superiors. So Edward III, in 1336, enacts a law that would have made his daddy proud. No man of whatever rank he shall be served a meal with more than 2 courses, except for certain festivals such as Christmas, on which 3 courses were allowed. Edward III said that many mischiefs caused by the many sorts of costly meats which people in this realm had used was the reason for this decision. But seeing as commoners were practically starving to death at the time, it's obvious where this law was pointed. These laws may or may not have influenced the behavior, but there was no real evidence of any actual enforcement of them. So despite this, the statute wasn't repealed until 1856, but there was no proof of it being used. Scold, and no, not what your mom does when you don't clean your room, is number 2. The word scold was used as a legal term for women who disturbed their peers or husbands' peace with quarreling, gossiping, slander, brawling, or even just talking too much. Imagine he left his socks on the floor again, you tell him to put them away, and boom, just like that, you're a scold. While being a scold wasn't a crime, it was criminally punishable, and they had quite a few imaginative and funky ways in which to do so, such as a scold's bridle, which is an iron cagelet or mouth that encases the mouth exterior and interior, ensuring that the woman's mouth opens or even her tongue moves. Metal spikes would lacerate and puncture her. Sometimes they would even add insult to injury by parading the woman around town in the bridle to face scorn, or by chaining her to a fireplace where she could inhale ash and soot and desperately try not to cough lest she gets the bridle's spikes. There was also a yoke, a type of wooden restraint that could either hold 1 or 2 people. A woman could be made to wear one alone, sent walking for hours under the disproportionate weight as a punishment, or she might be locked up with the woman she was fighting with, in which case you don't have the discomfort of the weight, but you do have the discomfort of staring at your rival's ugly mug for a while. Doing the do and when to comes in at number 1. In medieval times, there were numerous religious laws enacted that aimed to restrict the act of reproduction and the times in which it could be done. In a 7-day week, a married couple could only engage 4 of the days. Thursday and Fridays were no-no days, as people were supposed to prepare for the Holy Communion, and Sunday as well, because it was the Lord's Day. In a year itself, the 47 to 62 days of Lent, and then the 40 to 60 days of the Feast of Pentecost, relations were prohibited. For the 35 days leading up to Christmas, it was also banned. Anyways, medieval folks considered the eyes important in regards to a person's sexual appetite, so it was also encouraged not to make eye contact during banned periods with someone if you're attracted to them. That I can actually kinda get. It is a romance movie trope after all. Anyways, outside of a religious factor, abstinence during Lent ensured no babies would be born during winter time periods when food was scarce and it was harder to endure pregnancy. Eating with the rich starts off the countdown at number 10. Medieval recipes depict a large variety of animals being served. Adding to the ones I listed previously are horses, lampreys, cranes, and crows. Hell, even beavers. And let's not forget the animals created by their chefs. One homemade animal was called a cockatrice, and it was actually multiple animals' bodies put together before being roasted. A helmeted cock was another chef creation. It was a roasted chicken wearing a tiny helmet that was sat on the back of a roasted pig, because why not? Dinner in a show is always fun, so in late medieval Europe, it became fashionable to have an entremetta, which was an entertainment dish. One such example is bakers cooked a pie shell in advance, and then after it cooled, they placed live birds inside the pie and resealed it. When cut at the table, the birds would then all fly out of the pie, much to the amazement of the many banquet guests, assuming that all went accordingly. FIFA fans may want to skip out on this next one, because number 9 in our countdown is making football illegal. That's right, while I may be referring to it as primarily soccer in this video, what was still called football at the time was made illegal in the medieval ages. Now there are quite a few reasons for this. Most popularly known is that the sport was extremely different then. It was violent and aggressive, resembling more of a mass brawl with minimal rules. However, it was also because only 2 years after soccer was banned in 1363, King Edward III would implement a mandatory archery education law. This would ensure his villagers could be used as soldiers should need be. King Edward believed that soccer, but also sports in general such as handball, football, hockey, and cockfighting were distractions, and at that time they could be doing better things. I'm sure there are many of you that would disagree. Next on the countdown is number 8, the future predicting friar. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'll just jump right in. English Franciscan monk Roger Bacon is known through history for his shockingly accurate predictions of the future transportation and life that we have now. Bacon lived from 1214 until 1292 and was the successful creator of the magnifying glass. But he also famously predicted future machinery in his book Espetola de Secretis Operibus, if I got that right. Cars can be made so that without animals, people will move unbelievably rapid, and flying machines can be constructed so that a man sits in the midst of a machine, revolving some engines by which artificial wings are made to beat in the air like a flying bird. It's a little nonsensical, but you can see what he's implying. His other predictions included steamships, submarines, diving suits, and telescopes. That's pretty spot on for a guy who lived thousands of years ago. This is the same man who was also said to have sculpted a prophetic head of brass. Apparently, having been warned by a spirit that he must listen to whenever the head first spoke, Bacon set his assistant Miles to watch over the sculpture, which he did even past Bacon's demise. It's said that after the friar's death, however, that was the first time it spoke. First saying, "Time is," then, "Time passed." Ignored both times by a confused Mile, the head spoke only once more to say "time is past" before it exploded into flames. And so the chance to consult the mysterious head was lost when it combust. What do you think of the legendary Bacon and his stories of mysticism? Time is past, as the sculpted head said, so let's be happy we left this weird tradition in the past. In at number 7 in the countdown, it's the medieval animal trials. Under the ruler's power, there was no exception to medieval law, and so it should come as no surprise that even animals could face the brunt of their alleged crimes. This was no casual affair. The rich and the poor gathered for these trials as spectators. Some of the accused animals were even dressed in wigs and gloves, fancy garments to be seen in front of the royal court as their fate was debated by the lawmakers. That should come as no surprise either, seeing as the medieval era wasn't exactly overflowing with entertainment outlets. There are records of at least 85 animal trials that had taken place during medieval/Middle Ages. And while the most serious offenders were pigs by a landslide, there are records of some roosters and even one donkey facing the judge. What were these animals being charged for, you may be asking? Many times it was the act of attacking or eating humans, as food and grain for animals was so sparse they'd often go hungry. There were also some accused of being heathens or thieves or behaving in lustuous ways. So make sure you have a walking buddy and always look over your shoulder, because I guess you never know when an ill-intentioned cow may be creeping up on you. Number 6 in the countdown is the St. Scholastica Day Riot. February 10th of 1355, a group of students who attended Oxford University decide to go into town for a pint at the Swindlestock Tavern. Little did they or anyone else know that this would be the start of a notoriously famous riot. It started with belligerent complaints to the tavern owner about the quality of their drinks and service. As the tavern owner was progressively more berated, he and other patrons lost their temper with these students. The escalation led to a verbal sparring between the students and bar patrons. Both sides ended up arming themselves, but luckily, things were quickly interrupted when the mayor stepped in and demanded the arrest of the students who had harassed and assaulted the tavern owner, thus sparking this whole disaster. What should have been a peaceful resolution caused a chain reaction, however. Oxford students rose up in protest of their peers' arrest and swarmed to attack the mayor. News of that quickly spread, and the townsfolk revolted immediately. Many of them were already very tired of these students and their entitled complex, and had been waiting for the opportunity to rage against them. The riot that occurred ended the lives of 63 students and 30 locals. While the case's investigation led to Oxford winning against the town in court, the Oxford Council was still made to parade shamefully through the village every year on February 10th, and they did have to pay a fine to the families of each student lost. For number 5, we're getting a little spicy with risqué's men's clothing. Now, you may have already heard stories or seen memes about ridiculously long pointed shoes and groin-flattering armor, but did you know that provocative men's clothing was all the rage for a period of time in the medieval era. It's recorded that in the late 14th century, men were quite keen to be seen in overtly short tunics and thin tights. By 1463, a modesty statute had to be passed, as men had upgraded to wearing codpieces publicly, which did cover their mostly exposed genitals, but only by making them look cartoonishly large and bulbous in the process. A similar escapade happened with the Krakow shoe. These long, pointy-ended shoes were sometimes so long that they had to be tied back around the wearer's ankles or reinforced inside with a whalebone. The same statute in 1463 also addressed limiting these Krakow shoes for those reasons. Seems like there may be a little bit of a compensation theme here. Both provocative dressing and shoe length were limited to those of extreme wealth after the statute passed, but that didn't stop the development of some more outlandish beauty standards. For example, number 4 in our countdown is plucked bear. Nowadays, whether you're scrolling through an app or walking down the road, you're likely to see advertisements for eyelashes and hair accentuation services. And while that may be pretty trendy and normal to us, now, in the medieval ages, having hair on your face would have actually made you stand out in a crowd. Women would remove their eyebrows, eyelashes, even significantly reduce their hairline so as to achieve a smooth egg-like effect. This was because the forehead was considered the center point of the face for many years, and so it would make sense to remove anything on or around it so as to accentuate it, right? Maybe. Moving on. If you're tired of her plucking herself bald, and she's tired of you wearing shoes that enter a room before you do, then maybe it's time for a good old-fashioned medieval divorce by combat. That's right, you heard me. Coming in at number 3 is divorce by combat. This finding was discovered in a historic German manuscript that laid out rules as to how divorce by combat was to proceed. Their decision to use combat as a means to solution was not unusual for medieval Germany, as trial by combat was part of their law system. Trial by combat was legally sanctioned duel that ensured whomever was to win the fight was deemed right. There are many ways that these duels could be fought, and various weapons and locations in which to have them. The divorce by combat trial was placed when a man was put into a 3-foot deep hole with one hand tied behind his back. The woman, however, would have a normal ground and be able to move freely. This was believed to ensure a fair fight between the sexes. Now, there is some evidence that the outcome of these trials could still end in death, even if the death was not as a result of the combat. It's said that if the man lost to his wife, he would be taken from his hole and executed in the town square. If the woman lost, she would be then placed in the hole and then buried alive. So yeah, I'd say maybe try talking it out a little bit first before resorting to a public throwdown that can end in death. And while we're on the topic of trials, number 2 on the countdown is trials of the dead. Who would have such a vendetta with the dead that they would have them unburied to stand a trial? Well, new Pope Stephen, that's who. In 897, the months-old body of Pope Phomorphius, the first pope to ever be executed, was extracted from his grave to serve trial for his alleged usurping of papacy. The new pope donned the corpse in elaborate robes and even assigned a deacon for defense. You may be wondering why the new Pope Stephen had done this to his predecessor. Since a holy person's body was considered to become a holy relic in death, it became a holy rite to display their corpse in public tombs or churches so petitioners may still visit their former saint to leave tokens or deliver prayer. What better way to ensure that you have devoted attention of the community than a postpartum smear campaign where your opponent can't defend themselves because, well, they're dead. Stephen found the deceased Pope Phomorphius guilty so that he could toss his body into the Tiber River, as nobody can venerate his relic if his body is lost at sea. That's a pretty intense way to usurp the person who had the job before you. Joke's on Stephen, however, as shortly after this trial, he was executed just like his predecessor, making him once again come in second to Phomorphius. Call it karma. With that dose of crazy, we can move on to medieval madness, which ranks at number 1 in our countdown. What was the medieval madness? Well, if you're a fan of rye bread, you may not want to listen in on this. In an era without refrigeration systems as well as poor hygiene, produce was left to natural elements. As a result, mold and bacteria growth was common and would of course migrate into food. Ergot mold is the most well known for its effect on the brain. It caused wild hallucinations and extreme emotional changes as the chemicals in your brain became imbalanced. The consumption of this mold and bacteria has had a variety of exclusively unpleasant side effects, such as vomiting, diarrhea, convulsions, delayed visions, even mania and psychosis. diagnosis. These symptoms make it obvious as to why this could be labeled as a madness. The extreme cases of ergot consumption would of course lead to things such as loss of limb, gangrene, or death. And this connection between molding rye flour and ergot poisoning wouldn't be made until 1670. So for hundreds of years beforehand, commoners saw ergot poisoning to be things like demonic possession. Many theorize and connect the medieval madness to that of the time periods of the witch trials. The trials began in 1691, a year of intensive wet and cold which produces a higher level of ergot. They ended abruptly in 1693, a year said to be sparse on rye grain. If there's less to consume, there's less ability to be poisoned, making it arguable that there could be a connection between the two, especially as a side effect of ergot poisoning could be mistaken as demonic possession, as previously mentioned, and that is also seen as a symptom of witchcraft. Still, this may not be the kind of bread you want to chase.
Kicking off our list at number 10, rat poison. Yeah, this one's pretty gross right off the hop. During the 16th century, it was common to fill your house with arsenic trioxide to keep rats from your food supply, right? You don't want those guys hanging around. They're bringing the plague in, a little nasty. Barbara Gilbert of Leicestershire, she thought that she was grabbing flour and ended up mixing this stuff with milk. That was a really bad mistake. She thought she was preparing a meal for her family when really she was about to poison them. Now, it's horrible to say, but Barbara, she took a sip, thankfully, before her family, and then she was thankfully the only person who lost their life because of this, poison that they made. It's tragic, but it could have been much, much worse. Everyone dying because of a rat poison plague? That's pretty horrible. But it happened again in 1599 when Margaret Morland thought she was giving her husband ale. Really, it was arsenic trioxide and water, aka not ale. God, that would really suck. What a horrible mishap. Number 9, famine. Back in medieval times, food supplies solely relied on good weather and proper harvests. And obviously lack of rats definitely helps. If the seasons were dry, people of course starved. More often than not, common folk would survive on rations of berries, corn, and wheat. Now the lack of food of course led to disease. Now if they didn't starve to death, illnesses like tuberculosis, smallpox, typhoid, influenza, and mumps often did the trick. The Great Famine of the early 14th century was historically awful. Between 1315 and 1322, it rained for 150 days at a time. That's a lot of water. Western Europe was a mess. These conditions took the lives of 15% of England. Farmers couldn't plant or harvest crops, and the winters during these years were historically bad as well. Insane rainfalls and severe freezing. We're still struggling to adapt to weather changes today, but imagine the dark ages. Weather sucked every day. It was horrible. Number 8. Weather witch. Aside from that little ice age I just referenced, what was the weather like for most of these medieval travelers? 5 seasons of Game of Thrones. They talked about winter coming, but what were those winters really like? People in the 1400s believed that bad weather could be caused by the behavior of wicked people, like killers, those who sin, incest, that was a pretty bad one. Game of Thrones would have been screwed off the hop. That would have been a lot of horrible weather. Even family arguments were to blame. You talk back to your mom, next thing you know, the crops are frozen. Nice, way to go, Eric. It's on you. Now this eventually linked back to blaming witches or sorcerers who some believe could control the crops and or weather. Yeah, sorcerers controlling your crops, imagine that. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486, this book straight up references a witch that would fly in the air and create storms. Yeah, with effects that took lives of animals and farmers. No thanks, I'm glad we don't have any of those floating about. We just have drones now, which are just as annoying. Number 7, Jesus take the wheel. With witches to blame for hailstorms, who do we turn to fight the powers of evil, right? How do we get some goddamn crops back in the game? From the 14th to the 16th century, the ice pack grew around the world. Weather was changing in a drastic way, and by 1550, there had been an expansion of glaciers worldwide. Everyone thought that it was witches causing it. It's like, no, just plain old science. Back then, the general public didn't know what was happening. They didn't have Neil deGrasse Tyson explaining the phenomenon on a podcast. So people in the medieval times would perform rituals for harvesting crops in hopes that something would change. There would be special prayers, charms, beautiful services, all to ensure proper weather and fertility of the fields. Certain saints, like historical saints, they were believed to protect against harsh conditions. To protect us from the frost, we had Saint Servais, and to shield us from the winds, we had Saint Clement. And to fight back against drought and the rains, we had the one and only Saint Elijah, or Elijah. The power of the saints and the Virgin Mary were believed to protect against storms and lightning, so that's like the medieval version of the Avengers, I guess. 'Tis the season. Thank you, Saint Mary. Let's keep it dry. Canada has a huge huge storm coming tonight, so could use some of that saint power ASAP. Number 6, violence. Imagine going outside in medieval times. Is it dangerous? Is it lonely? Is it full of criminals? What's it like? What were those odds like just to get home? Street violence and brawls in taverns were as common as they are today. And like we saw a few times in Game of Thrones, peasants got a bit fed up from time to time. Yeah, can't imagine why, huh? Vassals would revolt against their lords. This happened historically a few times. The rebellion of peasants in Flanders, this went down in 1323, and then 60 years later, England saw the peasants revolt in 1381. A lot of peasants getting fed up. Yeah, I would assume. I'm surprised it took that long, really. Number 5, pole vaulting. The day pole vaulting was born was December 25th, 1521. It was a Christmas miracle, some would say. A laborer named Robert Baker, he was heading home from the church after a Christmas gathering. Severe floods interrupted his normal commute home, classic medieval flash floods. So Robert Baker, the quick thinker that he is, he grabbed a tall pole and he just vaulted his way over this new stream that had appeared. And then he continued home. He just carried the stick home and he was like, what have I done? What have I invented? Now at BumbleBee, we don't recommend this as a commute. Don't pole vault over things in general, unless you're a professional, don't do that. Because later on, when attempting that same stunt, Baker's pole snapped mid-leap and he ended up drowning. Yeah, the poor guy bridged to Terabithia himself. You don't want anything to happen like that. That's really bad. Again, in 1540, a similar case. Somebody tried to leap over a pond, but the pole wasn't strong enough and it broke and they drowned. Do you pole vault? If so, comment down below how scary it is to learn, because I'm interested. I don't know. Number 4, falling bacon. If they ever made a Final Destination movie that takes place in medieval times, that'd be an odd pitch. This would be the opening scene, for sure. This is crazy. Not sure how true this is, but if so, oh boy, my palms are sweating. It was February 12, 1543, and Elizabeth Brown was working as a servant in the household of a man named Hugh Talmash. Now this was over in Huntingdon. Things were going swimmingly, I guess, until a tragic accident occurred. Elizabeth was the victim of a freak accident while sitting by the kitchen fire. A massive unsliced chunk of bacon was suspended in the chimney above her to smoke over time, and that day the rope decided to just go, and then said bacon ended up crushing her. Now if you're smoking meats, don't put it above or near you. That's a bizarre way to smoke meat. And also, if you're smoking meat, must be nice. That's a crazy charcuterie board. Number 3, outhouse troubles. This next one really stinks. My gosh. If you're eating food right now watching this, maybe skip to number 2. I won't take it personally. Here we go. On June 2nd, 1523, a Cambridge baker named George Duncan went out to his back garden to use the medieval outhouse, aka the cesspit. Now today they're built a little differently, but back in the day it was a massive hole with a wooden rim. It wasn't pretty, it didn't smell great, it was horrible, made you sick. Now Duncan, the poor lad, rumor has it, he was a little intoxicated, and Duncan, while doing his business, fell into said cesspit, leading him to suffocate to death in the worst way imaginable. Now it sounds like a crazy way to go in medieval times, but it can happen today as well. Because in 2014, 2 people lost their lives trying to recover a cell phone that fell into a porta potty. Yeah, imagine that. Losing consciousness in feces is a dangerous place to do it. That's very horrible. That's a horrible way to go out. That's the worst way to go, I think. That's the worst. Number 2, clocks. Yeah, if you think a piano falling on your head is insane odds, now imagine a clock. Welcome to the medieval times. The 16th century saw the beginning of clockmaking, and early on these things, they were units. They were massive. Great-grandfather clocks, these early mechanical pieces, they were made of metal and were chock full of machinery. Weight equals danger, and in 1513, a man named John Townsend was holding an iron clock, very proud, when all of a sudden it slipped from his hand and it hit the young man right next to him, William Brett. It hit him right in the forehead, and the next day Brett died of his injuries. Guy died because he got hit with a clock. What a way to go. And finally, number 1, horse racing. I think it's general knowledge at this point, but standing near a racehorse equals not a good idea. Right, you heard it here first on BumbleBee. January 16th, 1540, 2 riders named Henry Headlam and Brian Newton, they were racing back and forth along a wall in a garden right outside of London. Casual medieval time stuff, just racing horses. Now, Newton's horse was going quite fast, and Newton didn't realize that he was approaching an elm tree. Now, his head hit a branch from the tree, and he broke his neck and died the next day. Now, right after this first tragic death, racing was seen as a danger to spectators and riders. More than fair. Riding a live animal at top speed, yeah, that's obviously a little bit dangerous, I would assume. But then in 1534, Jane Jonies was just watching, not even riding, she was watching horse racing, and then out of nowhere, a horse trampled her. Yeah, 4 days later, her injuries got the best of her. So if you're watching any live horse racing this afternoon, I don't know, have some distance maybe. Move up a couple of seats in the stands. Horse racing is big in Ontario for some reason. I don't know, we have like one big one, constantly busy. I've been your host, Taylor McWaters. Those are some horrible ways to go in medieval times. I'll probably be back with a part 2 because you know how it is back in the dark ages. It's pretty gross, pretty dirty, a lot of rats, a lot of ways to die.
Number 10, divorce. Today, divorces can go either which way. Way 1, it's a brutal, awful experience for everyone around you. Words are exchanged, property is fought over, and by the end, 2 lawyers are a couple grand richer, and now the kids get to say dad's house and mom's house. Wow, sounds awful. Or it can be a more pleasant experience where both parties mutually agree it's no longer working out, and they do their best to have a peaceful separation on everyone's behalf. That's nice, and it does happen sometimes. Well, medieval marriage and divorce looked a lot different. Who would have thought? 800 years ago, who would have thought? The main part of divorce really was just being the annulment of the marriage, assuming it was allowed. Rules changed depending on when and where it was. Whereas today, like my long-winded joke at the top of this segment, there's much to consider in a divorce, especially the estate. It's probably the main thing is the stuff. It's all about the stuff. The marriage itself is the least of people's worries today. But back then, it was just about not being married anymore. I want the bricks in the house. Like, what are you gonna, in medieval times, what are you gonna fight over? Like, I want the cows is mine. Number 9, off with the head. Another way to solve the issue of divorce and marriage was to get rid of your spouse. The same way Polly Walnuts got rid of Mikey Palmis. Gabish? You know what I'm saying? Most famously, King Henry VIII dispatched a few of his wives as the church really gave him no other way out of the marriages he found himself in. So, you know, off with the head. However, I think it's important to note that King Henry wasn't the only bloated throne sitter to have his wives dealt with soprano style. Things weren't exactly fair for women back then, or at all. Least of all, the law. It didn't have everyone's best interest and justice in mind, especially women, so there was a good chance that if the king didn't like you, you were gone. Happened all over. Number 8, adultery. There you were, standing like a wallflower at your town's clubhouse. Ours was called the Lions Club. You know what I'm talking about, small towns. Wearing a little old thing your sister lent you. Cowboy boots clatter as the music gets quieter. Then a handsome young man wearing jeans all over took you by the hand. Oh, romantic. You've been together ever since. I'm sure I literally just nailed that for some people. That's pretty much how they're married now. Except now he's not as charming. Now he's got a beer gut and he farts in his sleep. Ugh. Oh well, that's married life. I'm sure the medieval people went through a very similar process. What am I getting at? Well, when you get married, it means you're with that person forever. That includes the bedroom. Well, kings and queens of ye olde times ignored that rule. Besides the obvious political reasons for marrying, which I'll get to later, what was the point of marrying for love if you're just gonna have 30 mistresses or a secret lover? I would list the kings and queens who partook in this, but it would simply be easier to list those that didn't partake in that. You know what I mean though? What's the point? What's the whole point of doing it if you're just gonna, yes, we'll love you together forever, and then, how you doing? It just doesn't make any sense. Number 7, soldier on trial. Things weren't all bad for ladies back in medieval times. Sometimes they were given the benefit of the doubt, like in medieval France for example, where if a woman did desire a divorce, there was a non-violent way to get one. She and her husband would meet in front of a group for proceedings regarding their marital prowess in the bedroom. Of course, why else would I be talking about it? Meaning she had to prove that he could not prove himself a man in the bedroom. Happens to a lot of guys. In a nutshell, that means a group of people would handle, grab, stare, and examine a man's gabagool, pichadillo, sausage, Woody the Woodpecker, the olive branch, the Edmund Fitzgerald, the ballpark hot dog, the ambassador, the trombone, the one-eyed Bob, and the heat-seeking trouser rocket. That's a You guys get the point. It was a very embarrassing process, but if he couldn't produce results in front of prying eyes, then, well, that means she's leaving. Do you imagine that? Number 6, no Irish grandma. In society, we've decided that there are rules and laws, and rules that really just need to be followed in order to have an effective society, like no harming others or laws that help keep us safe. However, there's some laws that just don't need to be said. Some rules are self-explanatory, like no diving in shallow water. Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want to hurt yourself. No pooping in public. Of course not. I would never. I promise. And you can't marry your nan. That's right, you can't marry your nan. Yes, that's right. A law from medieval Ireland hits us with a marriage law stating that no man shall marry the wife of his granddad. You see, that's when you didn't have to tell us. We knew that. I knew that. Everybody knew that. Marriage laws were changing at the time because of English rule, and a lot of other laws were changing too, but the close family nature of their marriages, well, things get a little confusing. It was just about the time. I'm not allowed to say incest, I don't think, but it was incest. That's what it was. So they were changing laws, but it was kind of gross. Ugh. Now I feel gross talking about it. Number 5. The bedroom handbook. Like previously said before, when you marry someone, it's for life. You learn to love, and you do the bedroom dance with that same person for the rest of your life. For some folks, this was their first time, and as we all know and remember, that can be awkward. Well, imagine if you had a booklet or an instruction manual on what to do when that time comes. Like a Lego manual. Although sometimes even those can be a little confusing. I always have to count the pieces. I get it confused. Well, some churches back in the oldie times were doing such a thing. The Summe Confessorum, as it was known to be called. It detailed exactly on what days were allowed to make the devil's dance possible. By the time all the rules were read and followed, you were boiled down to a small window, about once a week, or sometimes none at all. And especially not on Sundays. Ooh, you better not do that on Sunday, man. Ooh, that's the wrong time to do it. Never do it on Sunday. Number 4, Dragonborn? This is actually kind of cool. So, in Viking and Norse weddings, there was a very unique tradition. We'll call it a tradition where the very handsome and brave groom would be tasked with a quest. Like something right out of Skyrim, actually. The groom was tasked with entering his family tomb and retrieving and or placing a ceremonial blade that acknowledges him tying the knot. Now, is that as cool as fighting off drogers and emptying literally every urn you see in search of gold and amethyst? No, it's not. However, I can't recommend entering anyone's grave before the invention of modern medicine. It's just not a great idea. But still cool nonetheless, hence it's on the list. Listen, I just got married. You on Grandpa's tomb, can grab that knife, just go in there. Just go Grandpa died of smallpox. That's okay though. Go in there and grab it, no problem. You come out, I got it. Anyway, number 3, royal weddings. While poorer class citizens did sometimes marry for love and support, and to have someone to go through life with, as being a woman on her own back then would prove to be quite difficult. Sometimes difficult more than it should have been. Medieval times set a very troubling precedent for those at the top. A lot of times, princes, princesses, kings, queens, and really anyone who held power or land were oftentimes married off to benefit that of a nation or a kingdom from which they came. In a nutshell, these marriages were political agreements, not holy matrimony, if you can call it that. Many times in history, nations swapped sons and daughters in order to save a little skin. Some marriages might go sour over time, but imagine one that you didn't want to be in from the start. Oof. And if you speak up, your whole kingdom might collapse. Yeah, not a good time, not a good scenario. Number 2, witnesses. I've talked about it before, but it still doesn't make it any better or easier. Every person you see walking around today was created by a couple things. 2 people, a Barry White record, and a little bit of friction. Unless you're a test tube baby. Sometimes, like you're a clone in Camino, you know what I mean? And Star Wars, you know, the big tube thing? Anyway, that's life. However, a lot of these moments are private, and they probably should be private, unless you're an exhibitionist or something. That's how you do things. Well, a lot of times for a marriage to become official, established members from your village or community would come and watch you consummate the marriage. Yes, that's right. Mom, dad, the bishop, heck, maybe even the gravedigger down the road because he's got an important job. My question is, what do you say when that's happening? Do you cheer? Do you laugh? Do you... Way to go, kid. That's my boy. What do you do? It's so gross and Close the door, Dad. Number 1, divorce by trial. My personal favorite on this list, divorce by trial or divorce by combat. Either or, same thing. It's exactly what it sounds like. What if divorce court had a little less paper signing and a little more club swinging? Sprinkle in a little bit of Hunger Games and bam boom, you got yourself a medieval divorce. It was a fight until you had to call Dompe the gravedigger. The wife had a sling and a stone, the man had a club and was stuck in a hole waist deep just to even the odds. May the better spouse win. Whoever was left alive afterwards got to be live free, and then now they were divorced because the other spouse was no longer breathing. Who would have thought? Who would have known? That's crazy. Number 10, horned helmets. The Middle Ages were chaotic times to say the least. There were kings and queens, wars, famine, and no social media to complain about it. Ugh, the worst, I know, right? I don't know how they made it out alive, to be honest. We think we have a pretty good grasp of the past, however, there's a few misconceptions that we still seem to hold on to today. A good example of this is the Vikings. the ironclad warriors who like sailing, raiding villages. You know the ones I'm talking about. For some reason though, in modern depictions, they always have horned helmets, which simply isn't the case. It might not sound like a big deal to us, but it's kind of like saying the Romans wore KFC hats. It just didn't happen. Number 9, Iron Maiden. Another medieval legend that might have gone over your head, or rather, in many puncture wounds that is the Iron Maiden. No, we're not talking about the band here. The very unique interview aid, if you will. Basically, the Iron Maiden was a steel or iron sarcophagus that was shaped like a lady or a maiden. And on the inside was a bunch of pointy spikes that will turn you into ye olde Swiss cheese. While the medieval times were full of unique devices to extract information from heretics, as they would call it, this is one invention of more recent centuries and not really medieval times. It's weird because there's already a lot of weird, strange, and brutal machines that would extract information from people in medieval times. So it's kind of weird they came up with this one too. I don't know. It's like a fake, but it's also just as... It's very believable. Very believable. Number 8, Jack and the Beanstalk. Maybe you do know Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack made a stupid decision. He ends up with magic beans. He plants the beans. A big stalk grows. He climbs a giant beanstalk and enters the giant's castle, where he steals a golden goose egg. Or at least that's how the variation I know goes. There's actually a whole bunch of different variations, but that's how myths and tales from medieval times go. Myths and tales like Jack often get changed around since they've been around for so long. Sometimes a lot of them are word of mouth, which means you don't always get the most accuracy. You only need to play one game of Broken Telephone to understand exactly how that concept works. However, I just had to add it to the list as there's some researchers who suggest that the story might even be older than its medieval origins. There is some researchers who think it's 4,000 years old. And it's a variation of another story of another story of another story. Number 7, Beowulf. An Old English tale of Germanic origins, or really a weird movie in 2007. I doubt some of you may remember that movie, but I do. I remember. I was just a kid then, and I was very confused as to what I was seeing. The CG, unfortunately, has not aged very well. However bad that movie may be, it's based upon an old medieval legend. Beowulf comes to aid the king of the Danes in Hrothgar, as the evil Grendel has besieged the fair people. He's a bad dude, you gotta stop him. Bad guy. After slaying the beast, the mother of Grendel comes for a piece of the action. Naturally, it makes sense. You know, get rid of the son, the mom comes. It makes perfect sense. Beowulf, in true Hollywood fashion, eventually gets her too, which, can you blame him? I mean, you have to get her too. And eventually he becomes king. Now, what's the lesson in this one? Always defend your beer hall from evil beasts? Who dare disturb Miller time? Yeah, sure. I don't want my Miller time disturbed. Or maybe that a 2007 CG movie, there was a lot of uncomfortable nudity. There was. It was really weird. But it wasn't like, it was like just a lot of skin, a little weird skin, and like shiny texture. It was strange, trust me. Number 6, Lady of the Lake. Have you ever been given that one thing? You know what I'm talking about. That one thing that you really, really wanted. For some, maybe it was a bicycle. Others, it could have been a promotion at work. For me and the boys at 3 a.m., it was beans. Anyway, just kidding. That's a joke for the internet. They'll like that one. Beans. Oh, coughing. Well, when you were given this thing that you really wanted, did a mysterious woman submerge from the water and rise from its depths and then hand it to you? Probably not, because if that happened, you should be locked up. That's like an insane level, like hallucination. Anyway. Well, that's what the Lady of the Lake did for King Arthur, except it wasn't a bike or beans. It was a sword, which, in a way, it kind of led to his promotion as king, so I guess that counts. Sometimes she's depicted as being a helpful lass, and others she's more of a villain. However, I think Monty Python says it best. Paraphrasing. Strange women lying about in ponds, distributing swords as no basis for a system of government. Supreme executive power derives from a mandate of the masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony. You can't expect to wield supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you. What he said. Number 5, Joan of Arc. You might have heard the name, but don't know the story. This one is really cool because she actually existed and she became a legend and a myth. It's pretty cool. So the story goes back to medieval times when France and England were at it again. It's a pretty common theme in European history. They fight a lot. However, this time France was losing bad, real bad, to the point where the King of France needed a miracle. Well, little did anyone know that their miracle was in the shape of a teenage peasant girl. Supposedly, she got a message from the heavens saying that she was the savior of France. Well, they let her fight, and not only did she lead with excellence, but she actually turned the tide of the war. That was until a bunch of stinky men thought she was the devil and burned her at the stake for such crimes, because you can't let the girls have anything. Why? Yeah, because history, man. Number 4, dragons, or wyverns, as they're sometimes called in Western legends. In Western stories and legends, dragons are large-scaled lizard-like creatures who oftentimes possess the power of fire breath. Nice. Sometimes they're there to challenge our noble knight, guard the tower, or really, they're just a symbol of bad. You don't want to cross a dragon. However, in Eastern culture and legends, it's the complete opposite. Take China, for example. Dragons in ancient Chinese legends are good, thought to be very good luck and a symbol of the emperor himself. Not that one, the Chinese emperor, not Palpatine. As much as I like our dragons, I'd much prefer to meet a friendlier one, especially at a Chinese buffet. Haven't been to one of those in a while since you know what happened. I missed that, man. I missed the buffets. Number 3, Monkey King. Probably the most famous legend out of medieval China. My first knowledge of the story came from Adam, actually. He was showing me a video game that was in production based upon this legend. It's pretty cool. Anyway, the story goes that this monkey was born of stone, and he gained supernatural powers, and he was imprisoned by Buddha for 500 years. His mission was to travel west to where the Buddhists were there, living their life as Buddhists do, and he was going for some sweet, sweet revenge. He possesses super strength, and he's a masterful warrior. You can see images of the Monkey King and his likefulness at festivals wherever his strength is needed. Number 2, Nian, New Year's Eve. For some, it's an exciting night. Personally, I prefer Christmas, but I also like New Year's. I, for one, enjoy a few glasses of cheap champagne and the company of the ones I love the most. I'm a classic guy, what can I say? Maybe a few glasses of champagne, actually. Not just one, maybe a few. All waiting for the fireworks and loud noises to shout Happy New Year, and then back to the champagne. Well, ancient China tells a legend of the monster Nian who would scare villagers and force them into their homes. That's when an older gentleman in the village suggested that they should use fireworks and drums to scare off the monster. Hence, he would be there no longer. Well, it worked, and they were able to vanquish the scary beast in all that noise and loud confusion. It's why New Year's and fireworks are such a big deal in the land of the East. Makes a lot of sense, actually. Scare off the demons, scare off the bad energy. And number 1, this one's really weird. Number 1, Chinese zodiac. Look, I can pretend I'm a spiritual person, but I'm just not. I'm not a spiritual guy. The only time I ever feel spiritually attuned is when I eat chicken parm at my favorite restaurant. However, I found this legend of the Chinese zodiac to be quite interesting. Supposedly, when the Chinese zodiac signs were being considered, the animals were tasked with a race, so that way the emperor wouldn't have to choose. Kind of like choosing for him. Makes a lot of sense. Supposedly, a rat beat out a cat after jumping off the ox and beating the other animals, and that's why the rat and the cat don't get along, and maybe why the rat doesn't get along with any of the animals for that reason. I, however, think it's related to the bubonic plague, but I could be wrong. Interesting story nonetheless. Number 10, the Dancing Plague. It was a normal summer day in 1518 Strasbourg when all of a sudden patient zero began to twitch and move in a way that was so peculiar. No, this isn't the start of a medieval zombie movie, which actually sounds pretty cool. This was a plague like no other, the Dancing Plague. A dancing woman shortly began to gather a crowd, and more people seemed to strangely dance. More people joined in, and then it became the Dancing Plague, which lasted for days, strangely. Some were taken in for medical treatment for the strange behavior. Today, no one is really sure what happened. Some think it was the devil's work. Scientists today think it could have been a mold-induced psychotic incident, and other people think it could be just classic medieval hysteria. However, I like to think it was John Taverner's newest mixtape.
Number 9, rushed wedding. Not all marriages back in the medieval times were for political and strategic gain. Some of it was actually for love, and some of it was extremely spontaneous. There wasn't even an official ceremony for a long time, and if you wanted to get married, the two of you just had to both give verbal consent, which is always a good idea. As you can imagine, this meant a lot of people would be getting legally bonded to each other in the streets, at the pubs, and while together in bed, which, taking into account that people were considered old enough for marriage at obscenely young ages, they were not really thinking with their brains right then. But hey, life was short and love was fiery. But because of this, it was kind of hard to prove the whole thing, so we came up with a lovely way of confirming the whole situation.
Number 8, Splash Zone. Let's get it on. Ooh, 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 babe, let's get it on. Ooh! Man, I love that song. I love the classics. You know, sometimes those moments in life require that special soundtrack. Like when I'm gaming, I love synth pop. When I party, I'm a man enjoy some Drake. How you doing, buddy? And when it's time to get low, I like the official soundtrack of Shrek. What can I say? Cinematic masterpiece. That being said, that's all that needs to happen in those intimate moments. For medieval times and in many places around the world, people would have to watch the signing off of the marriage. This included friends, family, local leaders, and maybe some nobility. You know, just to make sure the marriage went through properly. Gee, honey, I can't wait to go home and consummate the marriage. I figure if everyone shows up at 8, they can leave by 8:05. Maybe 8:02. Just stay out of the splash zone.
Number 7, men's fashion. By far, one of the best ways to show that you are not one of the lowly plebeians back in medieval times would be your clothes. We've talked about how stripes were the pattern of the devil, but they had some weirder trends back in the Middle Ages. For example, long and pointy shoes were a very big sign of wealth, and the longer and pointier the shoe, the more gold pieces were lining your pocket. Men loved to show off their bodies back then too. But they didn't have BMWs back in the day, so one way a dude could compensate for himself was the aptly named codpiece, which was a pouch attached to the front of a man's pantaloons, perfectly shaped and padded to display their masculinity. It's like that one dad at the beach wearing the Speedo, except maybe a little less nightmare-inducing.
Number 6, hairless. Nobody wants to go bald, just ask Jada Smith. Medieval times had different thoughts about this, however. Not only was a receding hairline normal, but that was the thing for ladies at the time. You might be thinking it's all about the waist, the legs, or the booty. Well, not back then. So, if the forehead is all the rage, focus on it, right? Makes sense. How is this done? Well, you can start by plucking those lashes. Don't need those. Then pluck the eyebrows. Ain't gonna need those either. And just start reeling back that hairline. Oh, perfect. Now you're ready for a night on the town. The history of women's fashion and traditions is a story of pain, beauty, and some really weird choices.
Number 5, animal court. Oh, did you think the courtroom was a place only for members of the human species? Au contraire. In fact, all kinds of members of the animal kingdom, from insects to dolphins, would stand trial if they were believed to be guilty of crimes. Some animals were executed, some received strongly worded letters, and some were even proven not guilty. A rooster was once given the verdict of guilty for laying eggs. Truly the most unnatural of crimes. Pigs were usually the ones who got the most amount of court time, with one account even having a pig dressed in a waistcoat, gloves, pants, and a human mask to meet his end. I wonder if these animals were judged by a jury of their peers.
Number 4, bloodletting. Look, we all know that a lot of men in their mid-40s treat their bodies like a rusted out Chevy Tahoe. I'm one and the same. Yeah, it needs a lot of work, but Dad got an oil change, so that makes it all better. This was common back in medieval times. A simple fix, or a one fix fits all for every health issue, was, of course, bloodletting. The old drain you of your precious life juice so you can get a detox, bro. Look, at first glance, yeah, it makes sense. If my Chevy runs a wee bit better after an oil change, then why not? It makes sense. Well, the truth is, there really isn't any new blood going in, so it's not so much as an oil change as it is so much just draining you of your energy, bro. Did it really work? Not really. Arguably, it made things worse. This was also a treatment to make your skin pale, and as my previous point with the ladies, that was also seen as beautiful, so remember that. Go to blood clinic.
Please don't drain your blood to look prettier. Number 3, Feast of Fools. Before the church took the fun of going overboard out of pretty much everything, every January 1st in France, the whole social hierarchy got topsy-turvy with the Feast of Fools. No, this was not a festival promoting fool-related cannibalism. Instead, the highest respected religious officials swapped with the lowest, and serving maids became masters, with a king of misrule being crowned. The event was meant to display the biblical phrase, "God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise," which is a creative excuse for parades, comic performances, costumes, cross-dressing, song, and naturally, way too much drinking. But like I said, thanks to the rowdy merrymaking and obscenities, the church was forced to ban it. Sad.
Number 2, funeral rites. Medieval times, people were dropping like flies, just how things went. So, when it was time to deliver folks to their final resting place, some traditions were in order. For those that couldn't shake the Black Plague, they were put into big holes with the rest of the poor devils who couldn't also. Loved ones were taken care of with, well, great care and respect, and others, well, they had modifications made to their graves. Like for instance, if you were suspected of being a vampire, well, you'd be buried with a giant boulder on top of you, just in case. You don't know. Maybe you decide to wake up and come back to town for a midnight snack. Gotta be careful. Some were buried without heads, the list goes on. All I can say is keep your garlic close, your wooden stakes, and just always wash your hands, especially when handling the recently deceased. You gotta get...
Number 1. Duke it out. Couples in medieval Germany had an interesting way of figuring out their differences. Rather than just arguing like any normal couple, they took it to the octagon. Honestly, yeah, let's bring it back. Trial by single combat was a popular way to solve disagreements, and when man and wife were fighting, they had some great rules that had to be implemented. As one example, the husband had to stand in a hole with a hand behind his back, while his wife got to run around with a sack filled with rocks. Seems a bit unfair, but hey, to each their own. I just imagine every time I have an argument with a girlfriend, and right in the middle of it, we just stop like, okay, I've had enough. We're settling this with our fisticuffs. Consult the marital duel rulebook, and have at thee, foul beast.
Number 10. Medieval aliens? With a lot of the tales from medieval times, it is hard to separate sometimes truth from myth. Many of these stories are actually hard to back up that we have from those days, even when they are true. I mean, they happened so long ago, it's not always easy to find substantial evidence which has survived to the modern age. And then there is the fact that a lot of things that happen in the medieval ages sound kind of ridiculous by today's standards. But this one is really something else. Apparently, there were two children who were found by a village who had green skin and spoke a language that was unrecognized by those that found them. The boy sadly did not survive, but the girl did. And when she grew up, she explained that she and her brother had come from a place that was very green and had gotten lost while tending their father's cattle, coming to Woolpit, the village where they were, via a cave. Her skin with time actually lost its green hue apparently, but it's never been determined where these children actually came from geographically, or if they even really existed, if this story is actually true or it's meant to be a folktale. Either way, it's a very strange story, even if we consider it a folktale. Like, what's that supposed to be about? Why was their skin green? And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at BumbleBee, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Number 9. Swimming test. I mean, witch trials in general were just a weird time, and one of the trials that was considered the weirdest by far in terms of tests, that is, not like actual trials themselves, cases, would have had to be the swimming test. Oftentimes those being tested were bound first and then basically dunked or tossed into the water after, of course, having been stripped down to their skivvies. Of course, being that they were bound and adding in the fact that swimming wasn't, commonly something you would have learned back then unless you were someone who lived or worked on a ship, there were accidental deaths that happened in regards to this test. The other super ridiculous part is we didn't really fully understand just yet how buoyant humans were, because we didn't know that human bodies were actually mainly made up of water. So they actually believed that if you floated, you were a witch, and it was a sign of the water basically rejecting you because you were never truly baptized, having rejected the sacrament of baptism because, you're a witch, so you serve Satan. I have to imagine that unless you were flailing aimlessly and drowning spectacularly, that most of those who were dunked were believed to be witches, and then even if you were drowning spectacularly, you might have not made it. Although, to be clear, they didn't usually tie a rope to people so they could pull them back up if that happened. However, I'm sure that didn't always work. This whole thing was pretty ridiculous though, because human bodies are naturally buoyant and don't really sink. It's not witchcraft. That's just science, baby. Number 8. Clown shoes. For some reason, people were really into long shoes back in the day. Really long toes. The longer your shoes were, apparently, the more refined you were considered to be. Look at these very long-toed shoes. I can't even walk in these. So hence why people tried to get the longest shoes around to wear. Apparently the shoes were so long at one point that they actually had to be reinforced with whalebone. I don't know about you, but I've worn long pointed-toed shoes before, once or twice, and just even having a toe that is honestly like an inch or two longer than, what I would normally be wearing makes it horrifyingly hard to walk around it. I was scuffing my toes left, right, and center. But I guess if you were really wealthy back in the day, you ideally wouldn't have to walk at all. So would this be a problem? I don't know. I would hopefully have someone carrying me around, I guess, or put me on a carriage or something. Number 7. Prayer test. I personally think I would fail this test really hard, even being a good public speaker and even someone that reads avidly. Basically, the prayer test was used to figure out if you were a witch by checking to see if you could read the Bible. This was also usually something that was done publicly, so if you were nervous, scared, or worried about your trial, or just if you struggled to read, like so many did back then and some still do today, you were in trouble. The idea was that witches would not be able to read the holy words because they were witches, so they'd be like, I can't read that, God is taking away my power. That's why this existed. While like many trials it was used as proof of someone being a witch, on the other hand, if you passed this test with flying colors, it also didn't mean that you were innocent, so you're not off the hook yet. So yeah, I guess classic witch trials, am I right? Classic tests. Oh, you passed the flying colors? Well, you could still be a witch. We don't know about that. We gotta do more tests. Do the pricking test. Let's do this test. Dunk them in the water. Number 6. The dancing plague. To this day, people still don't know what caused the dancing plague to happen, which is pretty scary and strange. We only know that it did happen in 1518 and potentially a few other times earlier on throughout the medieval ages. What happened? Well, people started to spontaneously dance and then tragically spontaneously die. Some of them died from heart attacks, some dropped dead from exhaustion, being unable to stop dancing, but what we don't really know, even to this day, is why. There are a few leading theories though. One is food poisoning. I gotta say, this one sounds the most likely to me. Not just any kind of food poisoning are we talking about here. We are talking about a fungal type of food poisoning that actually could have resulted in people getting dosed involuntarily with a hallucinogenic. Another theory is mass hysteria, and another still, although one that I think is the most odd and honestly unlikely, is that people were basically forced to dance because of religious reasons. It sounds unlikely to me, however there are cases of this happening. so maybe it's not that unlikely. Sometimes people were apparently forced to dance non-stop as punishment for their sins. Honestly, a pretty exhausting and terrible punishment if you ask me. I mean, fun to start, we all like to dance to start, but you know, when you have to dance for a whole year or something, that would quickly become the worst thing ever, I imagine. And of course, you might not survive that punishment, because dancing, it exhausts you. Number 5, marriage. Many people have this idea of lavish weddings being a huge thing in the medieval ages, and while that was eventually the case, the fact remains that it wasn't entirely true, at least not at the start. In fact, weddings actually became this big ordeal because people became confused about who was married and who wasn't, with people actually not even needing permission back in the day to get married and simply needing to exchange like basically a little vow to be considered wed. And because that could happen just about anywhere, private or public, it became very hard for people to keep track of, which is why we had to have a whole to-do about it. And it's also why people had to witness the consummation of marriages. That was also part of people just being like, you know what, we just gotta make sure this is happening. Yikes. Number 4, animals on trial. One of the strangest things by far to have happened in the medieval ages was the persecution of animals. Among them, pigs were apparently the most likely to be put on trial, and sadly, many were actually convicted of the crimes that they were accused of. At one point, a pig was even dressed up as a human for its own execution. I feel like that's kind of fitting considering really humans were the criminals here, I'm sure, in this case, so why not make the pig look like a human if you're going to convict it of a crime, you know what I mean? Really, who are the criminals on Earth? I feel like we are probably those people. No animals were seemingly exempt in France, even dolphins were apparently put on trial, and I've heard stories of lawyers waiting for their clients, the rats, to attend court, only to be frustrated when they didn't show up to trial. Like, hey, we called those rats. We sent them a letter. What, rats can't read now all of a sudden? Oh, isn't that convenient? If rats ever been able to read, how would sending them a letter to summon them to court? It's so ridiculous. I know being a lawyer back in the day probably didn't carry with it quite the same prestige as it does now, but just imagine becoming a lawyer only to have to defend a rat on trial being accused of eating crops. Man, you'd be like, why did I become a lawyer again? I wonder how they decided which lawyer gets that case too. I don't know, probably like you're the least experienced one and they're like, sorry, you're gonna have to do the rat trial. Ugh. Number 3, courtly love. This one is shocking in kind of a nice way, so I thought I'd include it here to provide some levity and surprise you about some of the things from the medieval ages that actually sound, well, I mean, kinda nice. While more physical intimacy was of course saved for marriage, love was also believed to be something that could be shared among multiple partners. Now, in court, there was a type of love that was known as courtly love, which was all about celebrating the love of friends and those close to us in even a romantic sense. There were even rules made up for how to do courtly love properly. These are the rules of courtly love. This is how we do it. One of the rules even read, marriage is no real reason for not loving. Honestly, true. Super adorable. Acknowledging that most marriages were forged for political or monetary reasons and not for love, with courtly love you could basically hold hands, dance, and even laugh with other people outside of your marriage. It was basically the people at court being like, yeah, we know that none of us are married to each other because we actually like each other. Of course, you still couldn't sleep with your courtly love partners. That was still forbidden and considered a sin. But even the idea of loving someone outside of marriage, even by today's standards, might seem taboo or unheard of. Especially if we're talking about people like holding hands and giggling together. Yet back then, it was actually just part of the courtly lifestyle, which in a weird way is kind of progressive. Number 2, the Children's Holy Crusade. If you're thinking about the Holy Crusade and also thinking that it doesn't seem like something children should be involved in, you would be right. But here we are. This was actually a Holy Crusade that was attempted to be started by a child. Although to be accurate, back in the medieval ages there were many living adult lives who by today's standards would still be considered kids. However, even with that context, keeping that in mind, this is still a pretty wild and terrible story, I gotta say. There was a boy named Stephen who was apparently 12 at the time that led this crusade, or attempted to anyways. When he went to King Philip of France seeking support and claiming that he had been spoken to by Jesus Christ himself and told to go on this holy mission to the Holy Land, Philip refused to aid Stephen and instead told him, hey Stephen, you know what, maybe you should go home. You're only 12, man. But despite not getting royal or adult support, Stephen did not stop. He continued on, gaining another child leader to his cause by the name of Nicholas. Apparently thousands of kids joined them both on their mission, although it's believed very few, if any, actually made it to the Holy Lands. We still don't really know what ended up happening to all the members of this crusade, the thousands of them, though it is believed many of them never made it back home to tell the tale of their adventure. So, pretty terrible. How did we just be like, yeah, go for it? I don't know. Seems like a weird thing. I guess everyone was saying go for it, the kids are just doing their own thing. Number 1. Corpses on trial. If you thought putting animals on trial was ridiculous and inhumane, well, you're definitely right. Guess what? It somehow gets weirder than that. In this case, Pope Stephen VI decided one day to put the previous pope, Pope Formosus, on trial. The problem? Pope Formosus was not only already excommunicated at this point, but he was also very dead. The trial went down in history as one of the most ridiculous trials ever, and ended up with Pope Stephen finding Formosus guilty, stripping him of the clothes he was basically buried in, removing his blessing fingers, and reburying him. Only to change his mind, unbury him, and then toss him into the Thames. Needless to say, Pope Stephen's reign did not last even a full year, and by the end of it, he himself was also dead, having been mysteriously strangled after being imprisoned. I wonder why. I wonder who did that.
At number 10, fashion. Back in the Dark Ages, fashion and high quality clothing were a symbol of status in society. For the elite, it was their way of displaying their wealth and high status over the poorer population. Because this meant so much to them, obviously they had to go above and beyond with their looks, and oh boy, did they take things to a whole new level. Everything was super exaggerated. For women, they just wore the finest dresses, but for men, that's where things got spicy. Male fashion was quite something. They would often wear dangerously short tunics with tights and belts to really snatch their waists, followed by the codpiece to really accentuate things down under, you know? But their shoes! Don't even get me started on their shoes. They wore some seriously pointy shoes, and to them, the longer and pointier, the better. Their elf-looking kicks were really what screamed, "I'm better than you," to the rest of the public. Some shoes were so long that they had to be reinforced with whalebone to keep their shape. These people looked pretty ridiculous, at least to our modern standards, but back then, wearing pointy shoes and tunics with the codpiece was like the equivalent to wearing a full Gucci fit. At number 9, helmeted chickens. In the Dark Ages, peasants didn't really get the best food. The good stuff was more so saved for the members of the elite, and these people ate some good stuff. I mean, to us it's weird, but to them it was finger-licking good. Speaking of finger-licking good though, let me tell you about one of their weirdest foods, helmeted chicken. No, it wasn't a special chicken that was prepared with special ingredients or whatever. It was literally what the name is, a helmeted chicken, aka a chicken with a helmet on. I know, weird, right? This was a theatrical dish to say the least. It featured a regular old cooked chicken that was stitched to a pig like it was riding on its back, and to add a special little something, the cooks would fashion a tiny helmet to make it look like a guard or knight for whatever lord or king that they were serving this bizarre dish to. This was a fan favorite because of how extravagant it was, but that trend sort of lived and died in the Dark Ages because you can't catch any chef doing something like that these days. Gordon Ramsay would have a fit over this one. Before I carry on telling you guys about all of the weird and crazy things that people did back in the Dark Ages, I would first like to ask you guys to leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and also consider subscribing as well to see more videos like this one. At number 8, beautiful death. Death was kind of a big deal in the Dark Ages. Sounds weird, but you also have to take into account the fact that the average life expectancy was only about 30 years old, so really, you didn't have long. Also, people back then were faced with some pretty harsh times like famine, cold, and of course the Black Death. Because they had to face death so early on and so often, the so-called art of dying came to be. The whole premise behind the art of dying revolved around dying a good Christian death. According to those who lived in the Dark Ages, your death had to be planned and peaceful. When someone was on their deathbed, they would concern themselves with accepting their fate without, quote, despair, disbelief, impatience, pride, or avarice, end quote. This art of dying thing was very popular amongst priests, and this actually led to a lot of painters at the time depicting people in holy professions as submissive to death and what was to come for them. At number 7, Feast of Fools. One of the more lively aspects of the Dark Ages was the many festivals and holidays that were celebrated. Though most of the population worked grueling hours for days on end, they often got breaks to hold celebrations. Most holidays and celebrations that were held were religious, but others were just silly and were designed for people to have fun, like the Feast of Fools, for example. The Feast of Fools was held in early January and was inspired by the pagan festival of Saturnalia. This was a pretty interesting festival because it involved swapping the highest respected officials with serving maids, and they became masters and were crowned kings of misrule. This festival first started as something confined to the church, but soon became a bigger affair with parades, comic performances, music, costumes, and even drag. These people really liked their festivals. Another pretty weird festival that they held was the Festival of the Ass, where a young girl carrying a child would ride on the back of a donkey into a church, and during the service, instead of saying amen, they would say hee-haw like a donkey. I know, bizarre, right? At number 6, soccer. These days, people regard soccer or football as a modern European sport, and though it is popular in these modern times, it turns out that the sport has been around a lot longer than you might think. Soccer was first played back in the Dark Ages, however, it is very different from the soccer that we know today. Back then, the sport didn't even really have a name, and there were no rules either. The only thing that people followed when playing the game was the objective of winning. Back then, you were allowed to win by any means necessary, besides deliberately offing people, of course. Back then, soccer became known as a pretty brutal sport. It was violent, chaotic, bloody, and sometimes even deadly. It involved an infinite amount of players, so it was really a free-for-all on the playing field. The sport was so intense that in 1314, King Edward II banned the game, decreeing, quote, "on pain of imprisonment, such games to be used in the cities in future," end quote. Glad things have changed since then, because FIFA would be really intense if it hadn't. At number 5, weddings. Marriage and weddings back in the Dark Ages were very different than they are today. Back then, because the average life expectancy was so low, people started getting married and having kids very young. Usually, girls would be married off as soon as they hit puberty, around the age of 12, and these marriages were not for love. Arranged marriages were the norm back then because it was mostly used to join families for status or for alliances. Marriage ceremonies were also very different back then. Because marriages just weren't as big of a deal back then as they are today, it didn't matter where you got married or how soon. Most people didn't need permission to get married, so they could hold the ceremony anywhere. Marriage ceremonies were held in places like pubs, in the middle of the street, or even in bed. Because of this, it made it really hard to know who was really married and to whom until the 12th century, when it was declared a holy sacrament that must be observed by God. To make things even weirder, the consummation of marriage was also pretty odd because it wasn't a private affair. The act of bedding wasn't seen as an intimate moment between the couple, but rather an investment in the union, so it was observed by witnesses. I am certainly glad things have changed. At number 4, jesters. You would think that being a court jester in the Dark Ages would have been a pretty bleak job, but you would actually be wrong. I mean, yeah, they looked funny with their outfits and hats modeled after the ears of a donkey, but jesters actually held a lot of power in court, making their job a pretty good one compared to other common folk. The court jester's job was to make people laugh by doing tricks, stunts, and telling jokes. Sometimes a jester would poke fun at the king or lord that they served, or would make comments about a kingdom's politics, and for a lot of people, saying these types of things would give them a one-way ticket to the gallows, but not the jester. Because of their profession, by royal decree, anything that they said was taken as a jest or a joke, so no one could get mad or offended at what the jester said or comments on. Basically, the jester was the one person in the court who was immune from medieval cancel culture. They could offend anyone they wanted to, and no one could stop them. At number 3, unicorns and Jesus. The thing about the Dark Ages is that it was full of superstition and mythology. Within this period of time, there was a lot of confusion when it came to religion, as paganism and the rise of Christianity were both hot topics. Many times, superstitions and mythology from paganism made its way into the religious beliefs of Christians, and things were known to get a little weird. Take, for example, the unicorn and how it was incorporated into the Christian beliefs of the Dark Ages. It is believed that a mistranslation of what is thought to have been an ox is what brought unicorns unicorns into Christianity. Because of this mistranslation, the Bible likened Jesus to a unicorn. Since it was in religious texts, people in the Dark Ages sort of just ran with it, and so they started incorporating the unicorn into many religious artworks. To further this whole unicorn thing, they made up a superstition that only innocent maidens were allowed to touch unicorns, and they even used the unicorn to come up with a rather uncomfortable allegory of Christ entering Mary's womb. This unicorn thing was also fueled by the Vikings at one point, as during the medieval age, Vikings were known to con people into buying narwhal tusks marketed as real unicorn horns. At number 2, divorce by combat. Back in the Dark Ages, if you wanted a divorce, you had to be willing to fight for it. Literally. In medieval Germany, couples would take to the ring to settle their disputes, and it was quite the showdown. Trial by combat was the common way of settling arguments back then, but when a husband and wife were fighting, things were a little more interesting than just having an all-out brawl. During these divorce by combat proceedings, the husband had to stand in a hole with his hands behind his back, while the wife ran around in a circle with a bag full of rocks. I don't really see how this settled anything, but who am I to question the methods of the Dark Ages? And finally, at number 1, animal court. I think that one of the weirdest things about life in the Middle Ages was their legal cases. As I just told you, their divorce proceedings were literally a trial by combat. They also found bizarre ways of trying someone if they were accused of witchcraft as well, and that was pretty dark, but the strangest court battles involved animals. Yes, animals were sometimes put on trial back in the Dark Ages. All animals from livestock to pets and even insects were not safe from the law, and they would be put on trial if they were suspected of breaking the law. According to records from the Dark Ages, at least 85 animals were put on trial for a number of reasons. Pigs were the ones who were put on trial most often for chewing off people's body parts and even eating children. In 1474, a rooster was put on trial and found guilty of the unnatural crime of laying an egg, and even unwanted rats were put on trial and received strongly worded letters demanding that they leave the premises. The most bizarre case though involved a donkey who went through a legal trial and actually won. This donkey became the victim of unwanted advances, but was deemed innocent because someone declared her to be, quote, virtuous and well-behaved animal, end quote. These people had way too much time on their hands. At number 10, shaming parades. If you've ever watched Game of Thrones, then you might be familiar with that scene where Cersei gets paraded through the streets of King's Landing while naked, while someone behind her rang a bell chanting, shame, ding ding ding, shame. You know what I mean? It's kind of a meme, but it's also based on a real medieval tradition called shaming parades. For years, people have loved shaming others. I think it's just human nature at this point. And obviously, back then, they didn't have any social media to use as their preferred method of ripping on someone, so they got creative. Very creative. Depending on what the accused did, their punishment would vary. But the one thing that stayed constant was them being paraded through the streets for everyone to watch. Specific punishments were given for specific crimes. For example, if a tavern owner served bad beer, then they would be paraded through the street and forced to drink their bad beer. If they were caught stealing a pig, then they would walk through the streets with a dead pig around their neck and a crown made of pig's feet. How regal. People would throw things like glass, rocks, and even dead cats at whoever was being paraded, and it was quite the spectacle. Now, would you rather experience this or being cancelled on social media? Let me know. At number 9, bloodletting. Back in the Dark Ages, medicine just wasn't the greatest. Clearly, I mean, they had a plague that wiped out 50% of the population in Europe. Even their quote-unquote doctors were overlapping jobs. Barbers were cutting hair, obviously, but they were also setting broken bones and bandaging wounds, so I'm not really sure I would trust that, but back then it was a case of you get what you get, so I don't think people were really complaining too much about their barber Joey down the street giving them a cast, you know? But other than the practice of patching wounds and whatnot, they were also practicing bloodletting back then, and it was a little much. Bloodletting was the practice of withdrawing blood in order to cure or prevent illnesses or diseases, so doctors would use things like leeches to suck out the blood of their patients, but they also used scarification methods to scrape away the skin to drain the blood, and others used lancets to slice open veins, sometimes including the jugular vein. I'm so glad that we do not do this anymore because frankly, I would like my blood to stay inside my body, thank you. Now before we carry on talking about just how weird things were back in the Dark Ages, why not leave a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and while you're at it, maybe think about smashing that subscribe button as well to see more videos like this one. On number 8, day drinking. Day drinking is a thing. You know, when you're with the homies and you pour yourself a glass of sangria and take a walk around the neighborhood in the middle of the afternoon. Not saying I've ever done that. It's usually a once in a blue moon type of deal, but for people in the Dark Ages, day drinking was an everyday affair. Now, people back then weren't necessarily drinking at all hours of the day just to get plastered and stay plastered. It was actually for health reasons. You see, people tried to avoid drinking the water at all costs over fears of illness because the water just wasn't clean and wasn't safe to drink, so they turned to the next closest thing that they could drink, and that just so happened to be alcohol. Back then, it was common to drink large amounts of beer, cider, or wine, and it was common to be drunk all of the time. Thank God we can safely drink water now because I don't think anyone could handle the hangover that came with all that heavy drinking. At number 7, no pleasure. The Dark Ages were heavily immersed in religion. In medieval Europe, they took Christianity very seriously and people followed the church very closely. The mission of people back then was to live a good Christian life and to not commit any sins, but one of those sins was a little unfortunate when you look back on it. Back then, any sexual acts that were meant for pleasure and not for procreation was considered a sin. That meant that sexy time was reserved for furthering the population and that's it. And if you did anything recreational, you would be getting a one-way ticket to hell. Along those same lines, it was also believed that female domination was also a sin, and so the woman could not get on top, or again, straight to hell with her. One saint, Francesca Romana, was so afraid of experiencing pleasure when she slept with her husband that she literally burned her lady bits with hot fat so that it would make the experience as miserable as possible. That sounds horrible. At number 6, cemetery fun. What types of things do you guys like to do for fun? Do you play video games, or read, or maybe you watch Netflix, or YouTube? Huh? And where do you like to go for fun? Maybe the mall or to your friend's house? Well, if you lived in the Dark Ages in Europe, you would go to the place that everyone goes for fun, the cemetery. Yep, you're gonna go kiki it up with the corpses, and unfortunately they're not corpse husband, although corpse, if you're watching, hit me up. Thank you. Anyways, back in the Dark Ages, the cemetery was the place to be. It was considered to be the social hub of the community. Back then, people held theater performances, elections, trials, and even set up businesses in the cemetery because the graveyard shops were exempt from taxes. There was quite a lot going on in the cemetery, but it was almost the equivalent of going to the mall. But I want you guys to tell me if you would ever be like the people in the Dark Ages and just go to the cemetery for fun. At number 5, an eye for an eye. When it came to the legal process in medieval Europe, things weren't always fair. I mean, they tried women for being witches and prosecuted animals for various crimes. Their punishments were sometimes swift and just, and other times they weren't. People back then believed that when found guilty of a crime, there were worse punishments than losing a hand or something. As I mentioned a little earlier, they were quite fond of public humiliation, but they also believed in issuing fines and even kicking someone out of the community altogether. If someone was found guilty of a violent crime, then they would be subjected to punishment that would cause them pain as well, but not to teach them a lesson, but rather to brandish them so that they would be recognized as a person in the community who did that one thing to that one person, you know? Since these people were very religious, they also had to make up with God for whatever crime they committed as well, so usually that would involve fasting, and then it would be up to Sky Daddy to determine if further punishment was needed. At number 4, the king's evil. Being a king or queen in the Dark Ages might seem like a pretty cool job, but I don't really think it was. With the rivalries these people had, they were at risk of being assassinated in one way or another, they had to worry about their bloodlines, and of course, the thing that everyone had to deal with, illness. Some kings, to help out their people, were tasked with healing an illness called the king's evil, and you're probably wondering, well, these kings weren't doctors, how did they cure illness? And to that I say, well, they touched it, of course. This whole thing started in the 11th century when Edward the Confessor became known for touching a person suffering from scrofula, aka the king's evil, and they cured them. People thought that this was a miracle, and so for hundreds of years after that, English and French monarchs were tasked with touching the sick to cure them of this illness because the monarchs were believed to be an incarnation of the divine. At number 3, tooth worms. If you're one of those people who really hate going to the dentist, just be glad that you didn't have to go to the dentist during the Dark Ages, because that was an absolute nightmare and a half. Not only do they not have any proper medication or anesthetics, but you could also get the worst diagnosis your dentist could ever give you, and that was a diagnosis of an infection of toothworms. They believed that people could be infected with toothworms that caused a tooth to decay, and that pits and holes in the tooth were home to a worm that looked like a tiny eel. What's worse than the diagnosis, however, is the removal process. They didn't want to pull out the tooth that was supposedly infected with these tiny worms, so instead they used a more holistic approach. A method that they would use to rid the worm would be to take a candle made out of sheep's fat and various seeds, and then they would hold it as close to the tooth as possible so that the worm would run from the heat and fall into a little dish of water that was being held beneath the patient's mouth. That sounds like a horrible trip to the dentist, that's for sure. At number 2, judging tears. In modern times, somehow we've come up with this idea that only girls are allowed to cry. I think that's pretty BS, and it's healthy for everyone to express their emotions, and funnily enough, they believed the same thing back in the Dark Ages. Back then, everyone was expected to cry freely, but the strange part of all this is the fact that people judged how others cried. Their tears would be judged on quantity, duration of crying, and frequency as well. They took their tears pretty seriously. Obviously, when someone was crying because of some kind of loss, it was pretty much nothing, but if they saw someone else crying for a different or unexplained reason, this was believed to have been a different kind of tears called the gift of tears. They believed that this was a sign that someone was thinking of Jesus and his suffering, and that they were so overcome with emotion that they were moved to tears, and this was also considered a gift from God. As long as someone's crying wasn't too loud, they didn't cry too much, and it didn't disturb anyone, especially during a church service, they were just considered particularly devout. And finally, at number 1, pee readings. This Dark Age tradition is probably one of the strangest ones I have ever heard, and you might come to think the same thing. In medieval England, people were known to get diagnosed based on their pee. Back then, they believed that the consistency, color, and taste of someone's pee could diagnose someone's ailments. They took this method of diagnosis so seriously that they published books for the wealthy so that they could do the practice at home, and these books included illustrations and color charts so that they could judge their own pee. According to their text, if your pee was white, then it was the ideal color and that meant everything was working properly. If it was wine colored like blue or black, then that meant that something was very wrong. And if it was green, then you were basically on your last leg and you should probably get your will in order. Now, I'm not sure how accurate these readings actually were since medicine was basically non-existent back then, but they tried their best with what they had, I guess. However, I'm pretty sure you don't need a book to tell you that your wine-colored pee is a bad thing.
Number 10. The Doomsday Book, 1085. The Doomsday Book was created under William I, also known as William the Conqueror. Like, you're already the first, man. You don't need two names, come on. This guy basically drew up a book to document people's money so that he could tax them. Oh yeah, this is the very first time surveyors went town to town and recorded how much money you would owe for simply just doing you. Men would show up at your house asking how much money you made and document your spending habits. 5 shillings on groceries, huh? Okay. And 5 on that phone plan. Look, tax season's coming up, Arthur. It's not looking good, man. Talk about a bunch of crooks, huh? Imagine owing someone money for just trying to make an honest living. Yeah, thank God that didn't catch on, right guys? Oh, speaking of, I gotta phone H&R Block. Number 9. The Crusades. A 3-part miniseries spanning over 200 years. These bloody and ruthless wars were battled between Muslim and Christians for the proprietorship over sacred sites and the land in the East Mediterranean. A 3-part miniseries spanning over 200 years. These bloody and ruthless wars were battled between Muslim and Christians for proprietorship over sacred sites and land in the East Mediterranean. Wars that resulted in 6 million deaths. The Knights Templar, a brotherhood of highly trained soldiers horseback bashing their way through the East. These guys were the real deal, almost like the Navy SEALs of their time. We've seen these paintings. The elite fighting force with the red cross painted on their chests. I wonder if they had to do a Hell Week. These soldiers were the most trained and savage fighters in all the Christian armies. Richard I leading the 3rd and final crusade, earning him the name Richard the Lionheart. Back then the names were always something so aggressive and scary. It was never like Richard the Clownfish or Henry the Pygmy Goat. No, we need fear. way more fear. Number 8. The Magna Carta. The year's 1215. We need some laws, people. This document was one of its kind. A document setting out the laws and limitations from the common man to King John himself. A legal system written down so that there are clear do's and don'ts. No free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or ruined in any way, nor in any way proceeded against except by the lawful judgment of his peers, and the law of the land. Did you get all that? Write that down. Except women. They don't have laws. And they can't act in plays. Sometimes people needed to face the music. And even animals. Huh? That's right, animals. Being tried in a court. A lively and popular event trying any law-breaking animal from goats to pigs to even chickens. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, did you, Mr. Feathersworth, peck the floor, yes or no? Objection, Your Honor, leading the witness. My brain can't fathom this, guys. Number 7. The Battle of Bannockburn. This infamous battle between Scotland and England was one of the most important battles of the Middle Ages. The end of the bloody war for independence. Basically, Scotland was like, yeah, we're gonna go over here and roll our R's. The gruesome wooden wars were caused by the English invading Scotland in 1296. A leader slowly rising the ranks, William Wallace, the guardian of the King of Scotland himself, holds off the English forces and is knighted a hero to Scotland. Unfortunately, like every hero back then, he was also hated. He was captured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. Like, why do you have to do all that after he dies? Like, he's dead. Not fun. The battles between Scotland and England ended in 1314 with Robert the Bruce securing Scotland's independence, adding like 45 more dialects to the UK. Freedom! Number 6. The Black Death. Ooh, talk about a curveball. The year's 1348. People are saying things like, don't let the bed bugs bite. Clearly not a very clean and safe time. The Black Death, aka pestilence, aka the Great Mortality, or simply known as the Plague. Single-handedly the worst pandemic ever recorded in history, wiping out somewhere between 70 to 200 million people. Ooh, now I get where bless you comes from. Someone sneezed back then and everyone's dead at 14. This is where we see those doctors in the terrifying bird outfits with the long noses stuffed with garlic and herbs. Excuse me? Yeah, he's not wearing a mask. I'm just trying to watch a cat publicly get skinned. Yeah, 6 feet please. Some doctors prescribed urinating on a person so that the bad smell would drive out the infection. Can you imagine? Just a doctor writing you up a script and go ahead and pee on yourself about 4 to 5 times a day. Take with food. Should be gone early next week. And just let me put my mask back on here before you leave. There you are. The plague started in Europe in October 1347 when 12 ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. Most sailors aboard the ships were already dead, but those who were still alive were covered head to toe in black boils that oozed pus and blood. Ugh. Sometimes the Black Death included fever, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, temporary loss in motor skills, and then, of course, death. Number 5. Joan of Arc. Finally, a woman in the Middle Ages. Who'da thunk? Joan of Arc was considered and still is revered the heroine of France for her role in the Siege of Orleans during France's 100-year war with England. Joan of Arc, a peasant with faith on her side, had believed that God had chosen her to lead France in victory against England and had spoken to her since she was young. At only age 17, she had stolen men's armors, a white horse, and like a Valkyrie riding into battle, she had convinced an entire army that she was appointed by God to win. And then did! That's the most badass thing I've ever heard my entire life. After such a miraculous victory, her reputation spread among France, and upon her capture and death at 19, the Maid of Orleans herself would forever live on as one of the greatest saints and symbols of the country of France. Number 4. Henry V. Another war? All these people do is kill each other. Does anyone fish? Or golf? No one, huh? Just swords and heads, swords and heads. A history itself. This time, England beats France. King Henry V, Prince Hal himself, leans into his kingly duties, demolishing France in what Shakespeare would delve into years to come. The Battle of Agincourt is one of England's most celebrated victories and was one of the most important triumphs in the 100 Years' War. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. Henry V, prologue. Good stuff. How come these guys didn't just like rap battle or play soccer or something? Like, an arrow right through the chest is way worse than a red card, just saying. Hey, speaking of soccer. Number 3, mob football. I'm not talking about the mafia. Put 1,000 on Brady, would you? I'm talking about mob football, also known as folk football. It's just like our modern day soccer. Town versus town. Except it has an unlimited amount of players. And there's only 2 rules to the game. Get the inflated pig's bladder over the opposing team's lines on the other side of town, and no murdering. I mean, I guess this is closer to rugby? Yeah, this is literally just rugby. This game was played competitively and eventually outlawed at Oxford University in 1555. Just a guy named Jeeves in a polo. Oh yeah, I play mob football at Oxford. Yeah, I'm also in a frat. This game got so out of hand it was banned numerous times in England. There is great noise in the city caused by hustling over large balls from which many evils may arise which God forbid. We command and forbid on behalf of the king, on pain of imprisonment, such game to be used in the city of the future. Thankfully this game has calmed down over the years and now has become the most popular played and watched game across the world. Go Liverpool! Number 2, the printing press. The printing press is a machine that was designed for the mass printing of text, mostly in form of books and newspapers. With an unknown date of origin, first invented in China, this machine designed in the 15th century by Johannes Gutenberg was a revolutionary new form of writing which would only change the direction of history with the mass production of uniform text. Long story short, people didn't have to get the world's worst wrist cramp writing Hamlet over and over again. To be, or not to be, 86 more folios? The alphabetical metal keys would be placed into the device and slammed into the paper, pressing ink upon the parchment. You know there's gotta be some books half written in purple ink because they just ran out of black. Come on, we've all been there. Ink's expensive. Number 1, William Shakespeare. The Bard himself, arguably the most influential writer of the English language. William Shakespeare was born in Stratford, England. One of the easiest ways we can look back into the dialogue and lifestyle used by the people living in the Middle Ages. This playwright documents the world in which he lives from 1564 to 1616. Due to Shakespeare's unbelievable talent for building and fabricating an array of diverse stories and characters via players, modern day is able to see the Middle Ages and the similarities and differences the people were experiencing. His plays are based in the environment that they were written in. He writes about diseases, he writes about monarchy, he writes about women's rights. Okay, so no one actually got turned into a donkey by some fairies in the woods, but some of those wars actually did happen, and some of those kings and queens were really twisted. How this man created so many brilliant works and stories, all part of the mystery. What do you think? Genius? Or did the guy have some help? One man in his time plays many parts.
Such as the forbidden omelet. It's not really an omelet actually, it's more like if you cut a pancake-like slab out of the color canary yellow. Back in medieval times, Lent and the other billion days they spent fasting were a miserable affair where Christians ate like lentils and dried fish every day for a month. The English came up with a solution for this tiresome diet, the tansy, a sweet and savory dish that was somewhere between a pancake and a vegan omelet. Tansies took their name from the Tantatum vulgare herb that grew across the country at that time in great abundance. Eventually a lot more ingredients were added to tansies such as parsley, feverfew, almonds, breadcrumbs, nutmeg, cream, and butter. Ironically, despite the love of tansies and the fact this plant was used to treat medical ailments, it was later discovered to be poisonous. Dangerous to consume, rub on skin, the whole 9 yards of poison. Hilariously, that did not stop the English from quite literally driving it to extinction. No more tansies now. And what could possibly be more tasty than something that you can make laxatives out of, perfume, and car oil? It's whale vomit. Ambergris is often considered as one of the world's strangest natural occurrences, and it's been used as an ingredient in food and drink alone for hundreds of years. Europeans used ambergris as medication for headaches, colds, epilepsy, and other ailments. The first reported use of ambergris in perfumery comes from Muslim Spain. It has been used for flavoring everything from cigarettes to Turkish coffee and even hot chocolate. If you like the TV show Bob's Burgers, you may know it from their episode titled as such, where the kids find a big old chunk of it washed up ashore in their wharf town. Something that does still happen nowadays, so keep your eye out for what looks like a giant chunk of earwax at the beach. Formed in the intestinal tracts of sperm whales over decades, ambergris is a grayish-brown waxy substance that some scientists believe is produced by whales to help ease the passage of objects they have eaten that they can't digest before expelling the same way whales expel fecal waste. Usually found floating in the sea or washed up on beaches, ambergris is not only been the foodstuff of choice for royalty, but it's also been a firm favorite of the perfume industry even today, thanks to its strong and lingering scent. Nowadays, ambergris has fallen out of favor as a food additive, possibly because people found out what it does and where it came from, but it's still used in the perfume industry, apart from in countries where it's banned, such as Australia and the United States. Another absolutely bizarre natural occurrence they enjoyed was the open arse. The rudest entry on this list by a country mile. Open arses were actually a commonly consumed variety of apple in medieval ages, and they do not look appetizing. What is that? It looks like a Photoshop project of a potato, persimmon, and a crab apple put together. I would say don't judge a book by its cover, but the inside is an effing mess too. Look at that. Who thought that was edible? Who said, look, that looks tasty, give me a bite? Literally has the composition of a moldy peach. According to the interwebs, the apple got its rather vulgar nickname from its appearance of the underside. The calces, which normally look like this on an apple, are very large, and they're spread apart on an open arse, giving the underside of an apple a distinctly certain exit human appearance. Somehow, looking like that and being still called an open arse, the apple managed to pick up popularity in the 13th century and remain popular for cooking well into the 17th. Dying of fever or just in the mood for an inconvenient, hard-to-cook dish? Well, you may want to consider roast rodent. Those little roly-polies, hedgehogs were considered a cure for everything from sore throat to leprosy. Their fat and intestines were considered the most viable. Hedgehogs may seem like an unlikely source of nourishment for us today, not just because of their prickly spines, yet their quills didn't deter determined chefs of the past globally, especially in medieval times when they prepared roasted hedgehogs by gutting and trussing them just like pullets. The hedgehogs were then roasted, and then only after they were pressed in a towel to dry and served with camelline sauce or wrapped in pastry and then broiled again. A piece of advice: if you're trying to roast a hedgehog and it refuses to unroll, simply take the dead body and put it in hot water. Or at least that's what the recipe books say. It's gross now, it was gross then, but hell do we love it. It's fast food. Stopping for a few minutes to pick up a meat pie for lunch was as common as hitting the drive-thru today, and just as likely to give you diarrhea. Just back then, diarrhea would probably kill you. Fast food cooks were notorious for using diseased or undercooked meat, or just warming up yesterday's spoiled leftovers. Again, not very different from what goes on at back at Taco Hell, or Taco Bell. Fast foods of London of the late 13th and early 14th century contained easy, portable foods much like today's Big Mac. Meat pies, hotcakes, tansies, and wafers. These meat pies, called umble pies, consisted of edible entrails from deer or wild animals, generally just scrap meat. These cook shops functioned like medieval drive-thrus where customers walked up and put an order at the window. The food was being mass prepared, then individually produced. They toss your little pie in the flames right there, pull her out a second later, and there you go, enjoy your entrails and wheat. In many urban areas, one street became known as the fast food capital for the city. In Bristol, Cook's Row catered to the customers looking for fast, tasty food. As a result of these innovative fast food kitchens, professional cooks emerged during the medieval period, employed at the great estates and in smaller shops of urban centers. So they colonized half the world for spices, but aren't the best at using them. It's sugar and spice and not so nice sauce. Spices were stupid expensive because Western Europe isn't exactly known for fiery flora or flavorful plants, and the only real means of transportation tended to die if you rode them too far, horses. So obviously you're just getting rare bits of dried herb brought back from crusades that you also have no idea what it is or how to use, and that's only if you're wealthy too. A lot of recipes described the peasants and even the wealthy seasonings as vinegar, ginger, garlic, chopped bread, unripe apples, and almond milks. AKA, most people were limited to flavoring their foods with whatever BS they had lying around, mostly the tart or sour, leading to the modern British tradition of refusing to eat food that actually tastes like anything. Like spices, sugar was so expensive that it blackened rotten teeth became a status symbol. It was so coveted that when it finally became cheaper and more accessible to the average person in the 16th century, people went nuts. They were rolling meat in it, vegetables, and probably themselves. People tried to liven up their bland-ass food with sauces, but the limited access to dairy and tomatoes were still a twinkle in the eyes of the colonizers. And these sauces, they weren't the sort of thing you'd want to dip your pizza rolls in as a result. At the beginning of the medieval period, sauces were based on milk or wine or butter or simply the au jus, which emerged as part of the cooking process. Because bread was so important to the overall caloric intake and to maintaining the consistent mold and food poisoning that was killing them all, flour could not be wasted to prepare sauces and gravies, except on the tables of of the rich. Their sauces were more like oatmeal, which you'd only serve on vegetables today if you want to ruin them. To give you an idea, one sauce is gruel, it's pounded oatmeal mixed with broth. Oh man, what a treat. Next up is beaver tails, but not the bannock type. Usually saying beaver tail, you think of that sweet, fluffy fried dough covered in sugar, maybe ice cream that's found at carnivals or amusement parks, or that hometown restaurant that sells them for $6.50 even though they're the size of your head. But medieval beaver tail? Whole different animal. Wait, well, whatever. Anyways, as discussed, medieval peasants were fasting like 3/4 of the year. That's a long time. So the church compromised by simply forbidding people to eat meat during fasting holidays, and then compromised further by agreeing fish isn't meat. But why stop there? People went even further by deciding certain parts of animals found in water that kind of looked like a fish, like a beaver's tail, counted as fish. Beaver tails were similar in shape to flatfish if you used your imagination. They looked like they were covered in scales and they spent a lot of time underwater, therefore they're actually fish. And they provided a cheap stand-in for the country's fishless poorer masses. But again, why stop there? The 17th century was no longer just the tail that was allowed on fast days, but the whole beaver itself. The beaver was a fish due to the fact it was an excellent swimmer. Unsurprisingly, the 17th century is the same year the beaver goes extinct thanks to overconsumption. Now the beaver is thriving once more again in England, Wales, and Scotland thanks to successful reintroduction programs from Canada, because we stay carrying that team. A medieval peasant walks into a bar and orders a drink, and has to correct the bartender because they ordered a cock ale, not a cocktail. This hilariously named beer was made by tossing a boiled and crushed dead cockerel with 4 pounds of raisins, nutmeg, mace, and a ½ pound of dates inside a canvas bag. The bag was then placed in ale and left there to steep for 6 or 7 days. It was then bottled and kept still for a month, after which, ready for consumption. This was the most popular recipe as shared in a 1669 news article by Calnan Digby. Why was this done to beer when it was already medieval times and it tasted bad enough? Well, it wasn't to produce dead chicken flavored beer, which is why strong herbs were there to overpower the chicken. The reason for ruining perfectly good beer with a giant chicken tea bag stemmed from the belief that the beer would be imparted with the cockerel's characteristics of strength, vigor, and courage. It was therefore mainly drunk by big manly men who wanted to be even bigger and even more manly. It was described as a pleasant drink, said to be provocative, aka it excited lust and aroused the body. In 19th century dictionary slang, cock ale was directly identified as a homely aphrodisiac. However, it naturally fell out of favor eventually for beer that didn't taste like dead chickens. I'm super angry about this one, but apparently it was only done in times of serious famine. It's roast cat. Cats were considered highly useful in keeping pests and vermin away. Dogs weren't so much of a commonplace thing, and usually they were the first to be eaten pet-wise when it came to serious food shortages. However, if the going gets tough, you have the option of hunting down some ferals in the woods to feed the fam. So, ever wonder how to roast a cat? According to one medieval recipe, you start off by cutting off the head and tossing it away, because it is not for eating. For they say that eating the brains will cause him who eats them to lose his senses and judgment. Then you do the cleaning. At this stage, the feline may look ready to roast, but alas, you must first bury it in the ground for a day and a night before you do. Then you unbury it, spit it, roast it, and whip it with a green stick. You can serve the roasted cat by soaking it in broth and garlic. To quote the end of the recipe, and you may eat it because it is very good food, which I feel like they threw in because they knew folks were not sold on eating dead ground food. And of course, what better to end this list than literal garbage, a real, literal actual name for a medieval dish. The historical food blogs are fighting for their lives to try and say this recipe is super tasty, and they've used the old recipe to make it at home. I do not believe you. I will die on this hill. This is probably the worst titled dish in history, and its ingredient list does not improve it. I have found 4 recipes, and each is just worse than the rest, all going as far back as 1393. So, most generically, you're gonna need all the worst parts of a chicken. You need the head, the livers, the gizzards. Throw them into a nice pot. Add fresh beef broth, powdered pepper, cinnamon, cloves, mace, parsley, sage, all chopped small. Then take bread, like actual bread. Just take a whole loaf and just put that in the pot. Boil it, then put it through a strainer, then boil it again. Add powdered ginger, verjuice, which is unripe apple juice, salt, and a little saffron. Then serve it forth. To have it English style means leaving the pieces of animal and chunks in there. When you serve it, having it French style is to strain it once more and serve it just as a thin broth. Imagine making it brothy soup style, serving that to your buddies before telling them afterwards what they ate.
Number 10. Duels. The Dark Ages, yeah, a lot of fun. Hope you're prepared at all times to defend your home, your family, and your honor. Good luck. You get a really sword as well. Break a leg or two. Medieval duels were a common spectacle among men. It was a means to settle disputes and display bravery and stand like this and talk like this, of course. Dressed to the nines in armor and tights, knights clashed on horseback and on foot, wielding swords, maces, and shields. I wouldn't be able to carry any of those. My arms would be shaking just trying to hold a shield. They're so heavy. They're so impossibly heavy. These intense one-on-one bouts were governed by strict rules, often overseen by heralds or nobles. Yes, our noble Joe Rogan will oversee this bout. Now bump fists. Ping. Duels showcased a knight's honor, with victory bringing respect to the land. Yeah, you gotta bring that respect back to your land or else you're not coming back to that land. The outcomes impacted social standing and reputation. While duels had its risks, it was an integral part of medieval culture. So go support your medieval times dudes. Go eat some chicken and watch an $80 show. They're pretty fun. I haven't been yet. Number 9, falconry. This one's pretty bad. So when you think of the Dark Ages and the jobs that were available, we often forget about this one. This one's pretty cool. Falconry was a popular pastime among noblemen during the medieval period and involved the training and hunting with birds of prey such as falcons, but also hawks. But hawkenry doesn't sound as cool, so we gotta say falconry. Rolls off the tongue. Rolls off thy tongue. These noble hunters formed a deep bond with their feathered companions through meticulous training. Now falcons, prized for their speed, agility, and keen eyesight, these were used to pursue and capture smaller game. Falconry served as both a prestigious sport, but also a practical method of acquiring food because, well, Uber didn't exist back then. But you know what we had? A guy with a falcon that we can trust. A scary man with a falcon who'd walk around and grill you all day. Number 8. Tights. I don't know why I said it so angry. I'm like, tights. In medieval times, men wearing tights was a fashion trend that reflected social status and style. I got a pair of tights for running, and I'll be honest, I've never felt more like a knight in my entire life. Pull them up, tight as a knight. Let's do this. Tights were originally worn for practical purposes like keeping warm and having an ease of movement, of course, but tights gradually became a symbol of high fashion among the upper classes. Of course. Can we do that with sweatpants now? Can we? I feel like we're close. They accentuated the physique and showcased a man's wealth and refined taste, you can say. Sure, we'll get onto that in a little bit. Yeah, all of that in one pair of tights. How lucky were we? Tights were often brightly colored, sometimes even covered in fun patterns. They're your tights. You're limiting them. Get creative. Why not? This fashion statement eventually influenced modern day styles. So next time you see a jogger, just think that's a noble knight right there, running to his next bout with his water belt. Number 7, cod pieces. Since we're talking about tights, let's talk about what we stuffed inside said pants. Said pantaloons. In medieval history, cod pieces were a peculiar fashioned accessory, trend, whatever. They were worn by men. Now these padded or stuffed coverings were designed to protect, but also emphasize the groin area, and it got really stupid. They really got carried away with it. It became a joke almost immediately. Originally serving a practical purpose, cod pieces eventually became exaggerated and decorative, symbolizing masculinity. Again, all while wearing tights, which is so funny. What a sight to see. Some guy wearing like the biggest cup you've ever seen. You're like, this isn't cool. You don't look like a really cool guy right now. Why is yours so bumpy? You should go see the local barber and get that checked out. Their size and prominence varied over time, with some, of course, reaching comical proportions, covering them in diamonds, studs. Like, you know, that doesn't look good, man. Hashtag not hot. Get out of here. Number 6, public bathing. Bathing establishments, such as a bathing house or a communal tub, these provided a place for men to gather and cleanse themselves. It was so disgusting. Now you think guys are gross now in the washroom and whatever goes on in there. Back then, these gatherings were considered a social gathering where men would interact, relax, and discuss various matters. Official means, okay? Watching a guy wash his behind while he's pitching you a beard tax. You're like, okay, sure, perfect place for a meeting. Let's do it. Mind if I cover up first? Weirdo. The act of bathing back then was seen as both a physical and a spiritual purification. Yes, so spiritual. All this is really transcending me. I love it. Let's go home and plan some stuff. While nudity was not unusual back in these settings, modesty was still valued, just a smidgen. So individuals would often use towels or cloths for some level of privacy during these meetings. Thank God. How vulnerable is that? Like, hey, any ideas? You're like, yeah, man, I'm naked. Why don't we get dressed first? Here's my idea. Number 5, Arming squire. Being a knight, obviously it sounds cool. They have the sword, the horse, the flowing hair, whatever. They're saving the damsel in distress. Sometimes they lose a hand like Jaime Lannister. Spoilers, you had 10 years. But that's just what being a knight is, right? It wasn't always a fairy tale epic being a knight. I mean, first of all, this process starts when you're young. When you were 7 years old, you would be given to a noble to learn for 7 more years, and then at age 14, quick maths, at age 14 you would become a squire. A squire is a knight's intern, not an ideal job to have when you're a wee lad, but it's a job in the medieval times nonetheless. Can't complain. Also, you had no choice. Get going. Arming squires, they had a lot of responsibility. Arming squires would repair a knight's armor while they were still wearing it, you know. Which buckle was it? Oh, okay, that one. Ugh, it's pretty wet and damp. Yeah, fixing up chainmail on a grown man's thigh. That ought to suck. Welcome to the Dark Ages. Also, after these epic, messy battles, arming squires would have to clean everything off their armor. Everything, yeah. A lot of yuck, and this was long before Dawn soap was ever a thing, so they had to clean with urine. Yeah, it gets worse and worse, doesn't it? Welcome to medieval times. Moving on. Number 4. Jesters. The earliest account of the fool, they go back to the 11th century. Now these fools were hired to liven up the party. Most of you may have an image of a jester in your head, jumping on tables, telling jokes, farting on your aunt and uncle. It's pretty accurate. That was his job. Pretty cool. It was one of the best jobs to have, all things considered back then, this title of a minstrel or a fool. It was an honor to have. The fool's payment was also no joke. Roland Le Couture, he was rewarded with 30 acres of land from King Henry II. As long as he showed up to court every year on Christmas Day to fart around. Literally, he would whistle, jump around, and actually fart. And in doing so, he had acres of land. That was loaded because he was just farting on people. Imagine eating beans on Christmas Day, having a nice time with your family, and then Roland jumps on the table, starts farting on your grandma, then he leaps back over to his mansion. I hate this. I hate the Dark Ages. Let's move on. I'm getting angry. Tell no one. Number 3, groom of the stool. Nowadays, higher ups in the office, they have assistants grab your coffee for you. Maybe they answer some phone calls. Keep the business running while you're off golfing. You know, whatever you want to do. Assistants are vital. The groom of the stool, that was a bit much when it comes to assistants. See what I did there? Assistants. We have some labor laws put in place now that I don't think we're gonna see an online job opening for a groom of the stool anytime soon. But hey, who knows? Fingers crossed. I'd love to see this again. That's pretty funny. Back in the Dark Ages, this role was vital and respected. It was created by King Henry VIII. Now this role was to assist the king, specifically to assist his bowel movements, his activities, his big old king sessions. You had a box that you had to carry at all times. Now that was where all the magic happened in said box, the dark magic that is. And you would literally follow the king around until he needed to use this box, because porta potties weren't a thing back then, and there's no way you're gonna catch a king squatting in the woods, so now we're here. Now this is your job. In fact, you won't even find that king wiping his own behind. That chore was also reserved for the groom of the stool. You're probably thinking, Taylor, which poor soul had to be stuck with this role? A prisoner? Somebody who lost their sense of smell, hopefully, ideally? No, only sons of noblemen could take on this role. And in doing so, they also gained access to every room, tons of clothes, and any bedchamber furnishings in a castle. And of course, high pay. Thank God. Okay, maybe I would do it. That's not bad. Would you wipe an ass for a castle, Chris? Probably, right? Not bad. You wipe your own for, you know, for no castle. So that's fine. We can get you a castle. Number 2, dentist, barber, surgeon combo. Get 3 appointments in 1, all in 10 minutes or less. How lucky are you to be alive in the Dark Ages? Back then, dentists were not a thing. You weren't gently encouraged to floss more. You didn't have a fun chair that went back real slow. But they did have solutions. They had one solution, and that was to pull everything. Cavity, gone. Toothache, see you later. Maybe you accidentally bit a rock, you chipped a molar. Doesn't matter. We're gonna pull it all regardless. They would only pull your teeth out. Barbers were responsible for cutting hair, pulling teeth, and bloodletting. I'm like, perfect, I need all of those today. What are the odds? They would use tools like forceps, pliers, and scraping instruments, all to address dental issues. However, and believe it or not, their practices lacked advanced techniques and understanding of modern dentistry. You don't say. 3 jobs in 1. Yeah, I wonder how long that took to graduate. That's a hefty program right there. So like, oh, it's 18 years. You're gonna love it. Yeah, no pay. It's good. And finally, number 1, the beard tax. Here we go. You may have heard about the cheese tax, but have you heard about the beard tax? This is good. I would have been fine. I really tried earlier this year. Couldn't do it, but I'm bald guy forever. That's cool. I would have saved money in the Dark Ages. My God, I would have had like savings. Would have been a good, great time. The beard tax emerged in certain regions as a means of gathering revenue and enforcing social norms. Men were required to pay a tax based on the length of their beards. and in some cases even the width or the shape. They're like, we don't like that, give us $5 right now. Lice infestations were a common problem due to the limited access of personal hygiene and sanitary practices. You know, men bathing together, pitching ideas didn't help. However, the length and density of beards provided a natural barrier against lice. So it was believed that back then the oils present in the beard's hair made it difficult for lice to crawl around and survive. Therefore, men often grew their beards as long as they could to prevent lice infestation. That's why Vikings had such big, long, gray beards. I take that back. I actually would have been screwed back then. I would have been so itchy. I'm itchy now just thinking about it. I'm getting out of here. See you.
With scalps so oily they could star in grease, it's no wonder lice was everywhere. You know what? I will give them a little bit more credit. It is true, after a certain point of not using shampoo, even the straightest of thin hair can regulate its oil levels. So their scalps probably weren't the worst, but maybe they were rocking some hella dandruff. Also, as I mentioned, lice. Say you're somehow living a medieval life healthily, being whatever you are in the castle. You're making a living, you're not sick, and nobody wants to tie you to a chair and dunk you underwater. Even if you've managed that, you still have lice. Bugs were everywhere, man, all kinds of them. On you, in your room, in your food, nowhere was safe. Lice was such a way of life that people treated appointments to get deloused in pretty much the same way people treat appointments for a haircut today. Maybe an exaggeration, but you get what I mean. People in the Middle Ages and medieval times took lice to their grave, living a life of itch, 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 itch. No one likes having rats and mice in their house. Unfortunately for castle dwellers, the dark, cold living quarters within the castle afforded the perfect breeding ground and lifestyle for plenty of rodents and bugs, carrying diseases that could have meant the end for any of the castle's residents. Name something grosser than a non-ventilated stone behemoth full of unwashed bodies. So why no washy-washy of the body? Why is that so difficult to accomplish? Jump in a river or something, right? Wrong. Leeches, disease, death. Also, hot baths are preferred. Regular and incredibly convenient bathing as we know it today did not exist in Europe until the late 19th century, so Europeans in the 13th, 14th, and 1500s were not vibing with that idea. Firstly, water was precious, especially during sieges, and the work was so hard and manual and labor intensive that you would build up a sweat the moment you got out of the bathtub, so bathing was seen as a waste of time. I mean, wash off 2 weeks worth of grime and one little batch of sweat made that a waste. Your bathwater's probably brown, dude, still seems kinda worth it. But secondly, the trouble of setting up a bath just didn't seem to be worth it. No running water, so if you wanted a hot bath, you had to boil the water yourself over a fire, carry hot water buckets upstairs to the bathtub, fill the bathtub and not spill the hot water on yourself, get the temperature right, put the soap in if you had any, get in, wash before it cooled, get out, dry, put your clothes back on, and then you have to bail out the entire bathtub by hand with a bucket and find a window to toss the water out of onto some unsuspecting servant. So yeah, it was a lot of work. And what of feces? What do these highly civilized, highly sanitary individuals have to offer us for the call of nature? The modern toilet didn't exist back in the 14th century. Instead, you either had a closed stool, which was a special seat with a bucket underneath, or you used a privy, which is a seat with a hole in it. So why not call them the same thing? Whatever, medieval people. Waste going through the closed stool, which by the way is where we get the feces nickname stool, was collected in the bucket, which was then removed, emptied, washed, and replaced. Waste that passed through the seat of a privy, which was the early kind of toilet, ended up in one of two places. If the castle had a moat around it, the waste probably would have gone in there. If it didn't have a moat, or if the privy was located somewhere without access to water, bodily waste ended up in a cesspit at the very bottom of the castle. But anyways, check out what some of the privies looked like. From what I gathered reading, there really were some castles without designated rooms for these. Just could find them in random hallways in case you want to whip it out and take a leak right there. At Perivale Castle, you often find privies high up in the wall, high above the smell and safe from attackers who might use the literal crap hole to get into the castle like a reverse Shawshank escape. The most famous example of this allegedly took place during the siege of Chateau Galliard in 1204. Talk about a crappy job, it's the royal bleep shoveler. You know the word, it rhymes. So, cesspit, the medieval crap dungeon thing. Though medieval people didn't know about germs, they believed bad smells caused illnesses, meaning when the stank started wafting up a little too hard, one unfortunate man would have to clean it out. Like rich people nowadays scheduling a maid, whenever this dude showed up, everyone in the castle would hightail it out so as to not have to interact. The gong farmer would shovel the poop into baskets and wheelbarrows and take it off to bury or spread on fields as fertilizer for the food they ate. Gong farming could be dangerous. Paris. In 1325, Richard the Raker fell into a cesspit and drowned. Say goodbye to sinus and sense of smell, as the acids cook that out of you, and stay away from the infectious bacteria literally everywhere. However, gong farmers were quite well paid despite people not wanting to ever get close to them due to their smell. Rest assured though, because castle logic was that closets and toilets are one of the same. The private castle privy was always sharing the same space as the residents stowed away personal belongings in a room called garderobes. Obviously, you can see this as a stepping stone to a wardrobe being a sequestered small offshoot room. Inside the garderobe was also a toilet hole next to your Sunday best. Logic dictated clothes should be kept close to the toilet to prevent insects from damaging them. The idea being that the odor would act as a deterrent for insects. Fecal odor. Okay. And what makes all of this so much better is that you never have a second alone. If you haven't caught onto the theme here yet, it is plain and simple. Castle life meant cramped quarters. It took a lot of people to keep a castle running. There were cooks, cleaners, guards, personal servants, and of course all the royalty as well. Plus, the royals that lived in the castle extended past the nuclear family. It was their extended families as well. As a result, most of the rooms were multifunctional, and the keep was the primary living space in the castle. Soldiers, servants, and even lords and ladies-in-waiting were expected to sleep in groups segregated by the sexes. For example, the women may have slept in bedchambers while the male servants, courtiers, and soldiers may have slept in the Great Hall. Even lords and ladies of castles often shared a room with a servant of the same sex. So, why is that gross? Religious and royal obligation to reproduce. Also, people without an obligation who would really like to do it anyway. As long as those people are married, you actually couldn't complain. In fact, it's weirder if you saw something and said something. So, if everything stinks and you got next to no windows, how do you make a minty fresh castle? The simple answer is they didn't. Mold, insect, vermin, and disease were all part of everyday life in medieval times. Fresh water was precious, and a reliable disinfectant was yet to be discovered. Eating a little bit of mold on your food or stepping in rooms with moldy walls were minor problems compared to actually finding enough food to eat and fighting off hungry wild animals like wolves, or not dying of the plague, or not being accused of witchcraft. There's bigger fish to fry. People in Norman and Tudor England lived short lives. If you reached the age of 40, you were considered old. Castles were very difficult to keep clean. There was no running water, so even simple washing tasks meant carrying lots of bucketfuls of water from a well or a stream. Few people had the luxury of being able to bathe regularly. The community back then was generally more tolerant of smell as a result. Inside the castle walls, floor coverings consisted of straw rushes, and later, sweet-smelling herbs like lavender and mint. This could be swept away and replaced when it was of a noticeable point of filth. It was said that an ancient collection of beer, grease, fragments, bones, spittle, excrement of dogs and cats, and everything that is nasty was seen when the soiled herbs were swept up and exchanged for fresh ones. But you know what doesn't help a castle? The smell of rotting corpses. Ah, luxury. There are heads of enemies cooking in the sun on spikes right outside your fresh air slit. There's the remains of a peasant shredded by mad dogs in the courtyard below, and someone is literally rotting just to your left in the wall. Castles were riddled with the dead. In the case of an oubliette, they were quite literally riddled. An oubliette is basically a little coffin cave thing dug into a wall, where a particularly hated prisoner could be tossed in, bricked up, and completely forgotten about. Fittingly, oubliette comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget. Given some of the other medieval death options, I guess starving to death bricked into a rat-infested hole wasn't the worst way to go. It still was way creepier to think that on any given day a castle had people rotting in its figurative basements and walls. Must have been for great ghost stories though, not great for the smell of their decomposing body quite literally wafting up through the floorboards later. Next up is how horrible it would have been to be a lady on the rack. So, ladies have periods and they need some way to handle the menses mess without the feminine hygiene products we have today. This ain't the Victorian era where it was commonplace to weirdly free bleed everywhere. Medieval women preferred one of two choices. She could always catch the flow after it left her body, or find a way to absorb it internally. In our modern words, medieval women could use a makeshift pad or a makeshift tampon. Pads were made of a scrap fabric or rag, thus the whole on the rag thing. Cotton was preferred because the material absorbs fluid better than the alternative wood, which not only repels liquid, but it's itchy and uncomfortable. Whether they made the choice of a homemade pad or homemade tampon, medieval women worried about leaks and stains. This is the main reason why red was a popular medieval petticoat color. The scarlet color was not only fashionable and decorative, but functional to disguise leaks. Now, the period ain't what's gross. It never is. It's what wealthy castle-dwelling women could afford to block said period that was gross. A common type of bog moss found throughout medieval England, Sophagon cimifilolian, was a remarkably absorbent material. Ladies stuffed their homemade pads and tampons with it, and folks even used it as toilet paper or as battlefield dressing. The popular name for this moss is blood moss. Entomologists contend that this moniker comes from its use in battlefield first aid. This account, of course, oozes heroism and masculinity. In reality, it earned the name from being used in menses and shoved up there. And definitely, my favorite on the list today is protection wasn't just armor. One of the most interesting castle finds includes the protection discovered in Dudley Castle in 1885. Dating from the early 1600s, they're the earliest definitive physical evidence of the use of animal membrane jimmy hats in post-medieval Europe. The intact deposits uncovered during excavations contained both domestic and organic remains of the occupying royalists who defended the castle under siege between 1642 and 1646. The keep's latrines had been sealed during the demolition of the castle's defenses in 1647. Examining further, scientists were able to determine that 5 blackened jimmy hats had been used, and a further 5 non-blackened ones were presumably unused, all folded in on one another. The Department of Scientific Research at the British Museum boasts that their significance was magnified due to the nature of the find and the extraordinary archaeological circumstances in which they were found. Who might have used them is unknown. However, the complexity of the manufacture must have made them relatively expensive, so perhaps the preserve of an officer class. It's known that officers' wives were present during the royalist occupation. However, this discovery definitely testifies this was neither the time nor place to pop out a kid. Stay safe and use protection, y'all. Alright, let's get going with how you're weird for drinking water. Because it's actually not true that water wasn't drinkable, just that people tended to get sick from drinking still water and they knew it. And they knew boiling said still water would make it drinkable, the way that spring water and natural well water were. People prefer to drink cold water rather than hot, and there was the paranoia that if the water cooled back down, it would become unsafe to drink again. So an alternative was to make something out of it if you don't want to drink hot water all season long. Thus, beer. The end product of the boiled barley mix would endure storage for weeks or months. Its taste would improve with time, and it was better than drinking steamy hot water all day. 2 batches would be produced from the same mash. The first was a full-strength beer, the second was lower in alcohol, and that was consumed more throughout the day while working or when you're just thirsty. So yes, while water was available, beer still was the bev of choice. People thought that you were either a nutcase or just highly devout religious if water was your go-to. One account by the Gallo-Roman historian St. Gregory mentions a boy so religious he primarily drank water. Ooh, shocking. Our next title is all about titles, because the medieval, middle, whatever ages were all about titles more so than any other time in European history. Think about it, I mean they literally called the system feudalism because of the constant feuding between higher titles. Kings delegated power among their trusted subordinates. So dukes are under kings and they rule duchies, counts are under them and they rule counties, the clergy's under them and they rule religious institutions, the mayors are under them and they rule cities, and then the aldermen are under those guys and they rule the villages. These rulers and other wealthy landowners make up the nobility. Below the nobility are the typical citizens, and below them are the serfs, the ones who are hard laborers indebted to nobles. Nowadays you can come from a small slum town and work your way up to Hollywood fame just using an iPhone and a ring light. Back then, if you were alderman rank or below, there is not much hope for you. You're locked into your social stature for life. A lot of us are probably feeling cocky, feeling like that's survivable. You forget the entitlement you have in your day-to-day lives. Because living back then, everything is a debt. You may be wondering, Teresa, how is that any different from now? Society's crumbling, inflation has destroyed the young generations. Well, let me tell you how status and debt in medieval times was just as much, if not more of a prison than nowadays digital credit system. So, now that you understand the system of titles, back to the average Joe, the peasant. Chances are you're a farmer, but you don't have any tools and you don't own the land either. The nobles have both the tools and the land. In order to actually farm, you gotta go to your local noble and he gives you the land and tools. In exchange, you give him a portion of your crops. Usually this is about 50 to 75% of what you grow, so if you grow about an acre of crops, you have just enough to feed yourself and your family and pay the noble. Now if you choose this life, which you will if you want to survive, you're going to miss a couple of payments to said noble, putting you in debt to him, thus a serf. Meanwhile, your local duke wants to raise an army to conquer the neighboring duke's land. He has to get get the approval of the counts under him, and the counts have to get the approval of the landowners. This is because, like you, the landowners don't actually own the land. Their duke does. The duke doesn't own the land either. The king does. The landowner sends some of the crops he takes from you to the duke already, but now he has another responsibility for him. He has to raise his army. Can you guess where this army comes from? That's right, it's you. Welcome to paying a debt with your life. But don't worry, being in battle isn't all bad. Look at why they invented chivalry. In 21st century, the word chivalry evokes a kind of old-fashioned male respect for women. But in early Middle Ages, church councils were literally praying to be delivered from knights. And by the late 11th century, early 12th, it was decided they straight up needed laws to govern these guys. Knights were essentially hired thugs dressed in tin cans on horses and were commanded by warlords after all. How great do you expect them to be? They were rewarded with land or the license to plunder the villages Game of Thrones style, looting, forcing themselves on women, killing the innocent, burning it down. But a lot of the time they didn't wait for that to be rewarded. Knights were known to terrorize villages and towns they came across as if they were bandits. For example, in 1379, Sir John Arundel rode to a convent and asked the nuns to put him up for a few nights. After they agreed, he and his armed men looted the nunnery, stormed a nearby church, stole a newly married bride, forced themselves upon her, kidnapped the nuns, take them out to sea, and throw everybody overboard. At a time where routine night violence and with massive citizen casualties were happening, chivalry was an effort to set ground rules for knightly behavior. While these rules sometimes dictated generous treatment of the less fortunate, they were focused mainly on protecting the interests of the elite. Hope you're one of those, otherwise you might die because a sociopath on a horse is bored. And now for the vast nothingness. There was nobody for miles. From childhood as far as your eyes can see outside of your house, other houses, and about 200 people, there is nothing. Just nothing. You lived and died seeing the same thing every day with only a few excuses to travel out into the world. In 1086, there were 1 million people living in all of England, compared with the 53 million today. By the 1300s, this had climbed to 4 mil, but the Black Death wiped out about 1.5 mil of those people between 1348 and 1350, meaning many villages were completely decimated or just abandoned. Traveling parties in medieval Europe were not exactly rolling in options for transportation means when it came time to travel. Horses, carts, human feet, and that last one was by far the most common. There were a lot of reasons why even the average peasant may travel. In England between 600 AD and 1485, these included going to mass, because early villages didn't really have their own churches, or attendance at the local court, which was compulsory for all free men once a month, payments of taxes to the royal manor 4 times a year. But just short of going to the neighboring big town, most never really left their homes or their home community. Women especially, they weren't seen to have much purpose outside of their front door. On a lighter note, pigs in your blanket. No, not in yours. Because when you live in a mud and straw hut that is 100% full of humidity and would absorb every smell ever brought into it, including that of the family beer bucket, what you want to do is add an animal pen to that and a loosely made roaring fire in the middle of the room. There were a number of home designs revolving around a single room first floor with a fence or other partial barrier dividing it. Animals were kept on one side of the barrier, humans lived on the other. This kept the animals' body heat inside the house, marginally adding to the indoor temperatures during the cold season and providing literal hell during the summer ones. But I mean, hey, you could always let them wander loosely outside. But weren't medieval houses like super tiny? Correct, but so were the medieval farm animals. Homies were undernourished and so small that a full-grown bull was around the size of a modern calf, and sheep were only a third of the size that they are now today. Modern sheep yield around 7.3 pounds of wool. Medieval fleece yield was something less than 1 pound per animal. And speaking of, let's segue into how all your food was dry. We can't truly know if medieval food was bad because nowadays we're spoiled. We have spice and garlic and proper cooking abilities. They had some meat, some grains, some vegetables, and a figured the F out mentality. As a result, we're gonna be more grossed out or picky with their food, but if we experienced it from their perspective without having tasted the food we've tasted now, it probably wouldn't be half bad. But hell would it be dry. Just so dry. That's the one thing I don't think any of us could survive, even with perspective. In the medieval period, meats and breads were kept well stored by drying them. Meat specifically was salted then dried. Bread at the time wasn't made with yeast, so it tended to be flatter and it didn't mold. It would just go harder with time. fine. Let's do some comparison. Here's the meat of the medieval period compared with some modern day beef jerky, the closest thing. Even our dried meat of the 21st century is juicier than the medieval version and probably wouldn't be the usual jaw workout. Now for bread, here's some medieval bread and here's some modern day bread of similar composition. See how medieval bread is a lot more enclosed and sturdier than modern bread? Looks like if you needed a spare tire, you could drill a hole in this bad boy, toss her on the frame. Medieval food was meant to last. And sometimes making things like these breads and meats were the family business. You may have seen the recent 10 reasons why living in ancient Egypt was impossible video, in which case you'd know that it was a custom of the times and place for a father to determine the career of his son. This ideology was shared in a few other places, ancient China, Greece, and medieval England apparently, where the trades were usually passed from generation to generation. Commoners in the Middle Ages worked where they lived. Consequently, it made it easier for their trade to be passed down from father through son through exposure from a young age. It also meant that the father of the household suddenly died or was called to battle. A son, no matter his age, could immediately pick up on his father's role and provide for the household, and thus it remained the family business. If your dad was a cobbler, you would most likely be a cobbler. Unlike the Egyptians, whose sons would branch out and try new trades as they got older and sometimes established their family in another commerce, the medieval English really stayed stuck in their ways, to the point that when they finally did adopt last names, they were usually that of their profession, which is why you'll see a lot of brewers, smiths, archer, fisher, potters, and so forth. But before 1066, you survived off of only one name, which doesn't seem that bad, but it definitely was. Let's explain why. Problem 1, if you're in a room with like 3 Williams, you can't just yell a last name to find the specific William you need. Problem 2, let's say one of these Williams kills someone in the room and the dying man says William killed him, but there's no way for him to tell you which one it was. Now all the Williams in town get rounded up. Problem 3, there's no cameras, and the eyewitnesses can verify 3 of the Williams in town as being in the room, but nobody can determine which one killed the man since they're all 5'4" white dudes with brown hair. How do we resolve this problem? Depends on the village, the clergy, and how much those Williams were each liked in town if anybody had a bias towards them. They may determine the right one. They may decide to hang all of them because they don't know who did it. When surnames were introduced, they'd often include a nickname, such as Richard Red if your hair was red. If Richard went bald over time, he could change it to Richard Bald. And now our last reason you couldn't survive is just by being Cornish. If you were Cornish, you weren't regarded as English. When the Truro received its crown charter in 1173, it addressed it to the barons of Cornwall and all men, both Cornish and English. Let's break into why that is in a little known history lesson. Cornish is straightforward, Celtic people native to the island of Britain. English is more complicated, derived from a Scottish pronunciation of the word Angles. The Scots, and eventually all of the Celts, had adopted this word to refer to the Angles and the Saxons who'd been invading their lands and who would soon form together to declare themselves the kings, forcing control over the Cornish people. The Cornish were made to do hard labor in mines, their language made illegal, and they were taxed to death to fund the other English colonial wars and pursuits, originally with the other Celts and then in the Americas, Africa, and India. Funding these colonial wars meant that the English stripped the land, so they clear-cut every tree and ran every mine dry, killing millions of Cornish people in the process. The Cornish rose up against the English tyrants many times, and on several occasions would have overthrown London itself if it had not been for terrible betrayals from supposed allies. Eventually, there was not enough wealth in Cornwall to sustain the Cornish. Millennia of Roman wars and occupation followed by English wars and occupation had destroyed the land and broken the people. This is what drove the Cornish diaspora, and it's why there's now 10 times as many English in Cornwall than there are actual Cornish people. Elders there still suffer the effects of intergenerational trauma and PTSD.
Starting our list off at number 10, natural disasters. We'll begin with the Great Flood of 1607, cause why not? This flood was a catastrophic event that affected the southwestern coast of England. Now the flood occurred during the night of January 30th, 1607. Happy New Year, I guess. Let's all run for our lives. And it was caused by a combination of heavy rain and high tides. This in turn caused floodwaters to rise up several meters and destroying villages, crops, livestock, and sadly claimed the lives of roughly 2,000 people. Sounds pretty tragic, but believe me, this is number 10. Yeah, it only gets worse right after this. Turn the clock back a few hundred years to the Great Storm of 1362. As its name suggests, this too was a massive storm that hit northern Europe, of course causing widespread flooding and destruction. It was one of the most destructive natural disasters in recorded history, with an estimated 25,000 people losing their lives. Sounds bad for number 10, but honestly, the lives lost, it just gets bigger and bigger as the list goes, believe it or not. Number 9, medical care. or lack thereof. In medieval England, medical care was limited and often ineffective. Yeah, nothing really worked that well because they didn't know what was happening, right? Instead of cavities, they thought you had worms crawling around in your teeth. Good old tooth worms. Knock that out with a rusty hammer. Knowledge was limited, physicians were expensive and mostly treated wealthy patients at the time, while the peasants over here, us peasants eating bread, rotten dry bread breaking our teeth, well, we got the barber surgeons who performed basic surgeries and bloodletting. That's about it. It's all they did. You walked in, you're walking out lightheaded. You're gonna faint immediately. They were a barber slash dentist slash surgeon. What? You already know you're screwed when you see that resume. Herbal remedies and charms were commonly used because, well, that's all they had, and the church played a significant role in healing practices. Aside from that, not much left. You're SOL, my friend. Hospitals were established to care for the sick, but conditions were often unsanitary, and going there led to the spread of disease rather than curing anything. Medical knowledge, again, was so limited, and many diseases and injuries were untreatable, leading to a high mortality rate that we're going to talk about a bit later. Ooh, it gets worse. It gets worse. Number 8, punishments. The pillory was a device that consisted of a wooden framework with holes for the head and the hands. Offenders were placed in the pillory while they were publicly exposed and sometimes pelted with rotten food and or hard objects. Sounds pretty nasty. The whipping post is exactly what you would imagine. A wooden post to which offenders were bound to, and then of course they were whipped with a whip or a rod. This punishment was often used for minor offenses, believe it or not. Yeah, it gets worse. The ducking stool was a chair attached to a long pole that was used to dunk offenders in water, often in a pond or a river, dirty river. You get an ear infection in that one for sure. It was used to punish scolds and nagging wives. Yeah, bring on your nagging wives. We'll just take them for a dip, I guess. Your arms are gonna be jacked by the end of it. The brank. This was a metal mask that was placed over the head of the offender with a sharp piece of metal, and then that metal would go in your mouth and prevent you from talking. It's like a saw trap. As I was describing it, I was freaking myself out just then. This punishment was often used for gossipers. Yeah. Again, these were all minor offenses, all things considered. Today, you get a slap on the wrist. Back then, you get rotten food hucked at you. What? Number 7, poor sanitation. Yeah, you're gonna wash your hands many a times in medieval England. Oh boy. Sing happy birthday thrice. How does that sound? Sanitation during medieval England was very poor and resulted in widespread diseases and epidemics. Thought today was yucky? Way worse. There was a lack of understanding of hygiene and the connection between poor sanitation and illness. Waste and sewage were commonly disposed of in the streets, just hey, why not, what up? Or it was dumped in the Thames, leading to a high concentration of filth and contamination, which I'll talk about that more later. That's a really bad day happens with that river. Public bathhouses were both used for bathing and toilets, so pick which side you're gonna use accordingly. Better be confident which side you're going into. This of course led to the increase of diseases being spread. The lack of proper waste management also attracted rats and other vermin, which again carried fleas and other diseases, so it was just a big bad circle. The Great Stink of London. This one here was a major environmental crisis. It was a crisis, a stinky crisis, that occurred in the hot summer of 1858. The River Thames, which flowed through the heart of the city, well, this was heavily polluted with raw sewage and industrial waste, and the stench was so bad, Parliament had to suspend its sessions. Number 6, lot of rats. Yep, watch your feet, it's medieval England, they're gonna bite ya. Imagine you're with your friends and family, gathering around a table, eating bread, drinking ale, gathered around one candle, telling tales, good old medieval times. Then all of a sudden you feel a tickle on your leg. What could that be? Be a shame if, I don't know, hundreds of rats began to swarm your feet out of nowhere. Yeah, welcome to the Dark Ages. This happened. Rats would come out of nowhere and it would suck. Then you have the plague. The plague crawled rather, into medieval times back in 1328, and it lasted until 1350. That is a very long time to be stuck with plague rats. It was actually horrible. Don't get me wrong, our plague sucked. That was a lousy few years, no doubt about it. A lot of Ozark, a lot of Netflix, a lot of time off. But I sure as hell didn't see any random swarms of black rats. Did you? Maybe, I don't know, where were you? The European population was reduced by 1/3, and rats were the main cause of spreading. Yeah, way to go guys, you nailed it. Ratatouille and Stuart Little, all you guys planning your little rat attacks, nasty, you're all nasty. No franchises for either of you, no more. These hairy balls of yuck pass it on to everybody. We gotta move on before I throw up. Number 5, superstition. Yes, here we go, this one's good. In the medieval era, cats were often associated with witchcraft. Because of course, look at them, right? So evil. The church, which held great power during the medieval period, condemned cats as a symbol of paganism and the devil, of course leading to widespread persecution. However, the rapid decline of cats led to a significant increase in that rodent population. Yeah, remember those fun balls of fur that I just mentioned? That's where this all started, because of evil devil cats. It was our fault the whole time. Who would have thought? The condemning of cats led to a surge in a number of rats and mice that carried diseases. King Edgar the Peaceful, so peaceful, we know him. He reigned from 959 to 975. He issued a law in the 10th century that set a value on cats and imposed fines on anyone who harmed or killed them. Now we're talking. Now we're getting back into the nice peaceful. The peaceful, I mean, come on. The law was intended to encourage the breeding and keeping of cats, as they were now seen as valuable for controlling the rodent population that threatened crops, food supplies, and us. We matter as well, I guess, humans. Number 4, law and order. Misuse of weights and measures. Yes, false advertising back in the olden days. Let's talk about this. How did you sell stuff without, getting caught? Medieval merchants were required to use standard weights and measures when selling goods, right? That's protocol. And those who tried to cheat by using inaccurate measures or weights could face some brutal penalties. I saw a video of some expert fisher and he's putting weights in a fish's mouth. He was trying to cheat his way through a fishing tournament. He got caught. It was on Reddit. So funny. But like back in the medieval times, he would have been screwed. Fraudulent begging as well. We've seen this on Reddit at some point. Begging was a common practice in medieval times, but those who were caught faking a disability or pretending to be in dire times, well, then they could be punished with public humiliation or even physical mutilation. They rhyme, but they're very different things, those two. Eavesdropping as well, one of my favorite things to do of all time. Love listening in on things, right? Listening in on somebody else's conversation is great, but back in the Dark Ages, this was considered a serious crime. And those who were caught listening, what's that? They could be fined or imprisoned, and in some cases, eavesdropping was seen as a form of treason, since it could be used to gather information that could be used against the state. So sometimes, yeah, real bad. You don't want to hear the wrong thing, or else they would, gallows. You hear? Gallows. Number 3, health plan? Yeah, question mark, because yeah, here we go. During medieval England, the average life expectancy was around 30 to 35 years, with many people biting the bullet to poor nutrition, lack of sanitation, infectious diseases, and rats everywhere. Living conditions sucked, limited medical knowledge was all you had, and frequent wars and famines were always rolling around. So yeah, all that in 30 years or less. How fun. Common illnesses included respiratory infection, dysentery, and tuberculosis. Medical treatments weren't great at the time, of course. There was a lot of prayers, that's for sure. A lot of people relied on those. Dark Age medical treatments included herbal remedies, bloodletting, and surgical procedures performed all without anesthesia. So you're gonna feel every wrong move to say that. However, there was also some advancements in medicine during this time. It wasn't all bad, including the founding of hospitals and the use of quarantine to prevent further spread of disease. How fun is that? Imagine being the first person to think of a quarantine. You're like, hey you, no, go over there. How does that sound? Yeah, we're doing something right now, trust me. Number 2, war. What is it good for, In the Middle Ages, this was a time of frequent warfare in Europe. This was due to various factors such as the rise of feudalism, religious conflicts, and territorial disputes, all those good things. One of the most significant was the 100 Years' War, which began in 1337 and lasted, well, as you could guess, until 1453. Yeah, it wasn't quite. It was 100 and a bit, but sounds cool if we say it like that. It was fought between England and France over control of territory in France. The war saw significant battles such as the Battle of Agincourt and the Siege of Orleans, and it had a profound impact on both countries. Another notable medieval war, you probably heard of this one, the Crusades. Yeah, that one for sure. The Crusades were a series of religious wars fought between the Christian nations of Europe and Muslim nations of the Middle East. Now the Crusades began in 1096 and lasted until the late 13th century, with varying degrees of success and failure from both sides, to say the least. A lot of deaths, a lot of warfare, a lot of horribleness, horrible ways to go. And finally, number 1, plagues. The well known of these plagues back then was the Black Death, which, scary name, but yeah, it's pretty much nailed it. The Black Death first appeared in the mid-14th century and killed an estimated 25 million people in Europe, or at that point, 1/3 of the population. Yersinia pestis bacterium was spread by fleas that infested rats. Again, so awful. Other medieval plagues include the Justinian plague, which struck the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century and killed an estimated 25 million people, and the plague of Athens, which hit, Athens during the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BC. Another deadly outbreak during the medieval period was the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720, killed 100,000 people in France. While it's one thing to live life through a plague like we have done, we can be glad that it's not like these ones, because they lasted much longer. And like I mentioned earlier, I don't f with rats, so Yeah, this one seems a little more calm near the toes. That's always great, love that. Number 10, trial by jury. The concept of trial by jury can be traced back to ancient Greece and Rome. Don't get me wrong, that's old school. But the first recorded use of a modern jury system, that dates back to the 12th century England. Medieval England, yes, let's get some men in a room and point at witches. Henry II introduced the practice to replace previous methods of trial, which at that point was relying on physical combat or divine intervention, all that kind of like that. Under this new system, a group of 12 men from the community would be chosen to hear evidence and determine the guilt or innocence of said accused. Right? A little better, a little, less witchcraft, more, okay, we're all talking now, we're conversing. This system gradually spread throughout Europe and then beyond, so on and danforth, and it became an important cornerstone of many modern legal systems. Back in the day, this was a noble deed. It was an honor to be part of the jury, Today, not really so much, not the same at all. You're like, what? No, I don't want to do that. It's gonna take so long. It's gonna be like 4 weeks of jury duty. I haven't done it yet. I've just jinxed myself. I'm gonna get called any day now. Don't answer, you know what I mean? Just don't answer your mail, don't look, just avoid it. That's what I do. Number 9, the stocks. All right, relax, stock bros. I'm not talking about those stocks. I'm talking medieval stocks. Those ones are a bit different. Those ones were very bad. Those are all bad. The stocks were a common form of punishment in medieval times. The convicted person's ankles were locked into these wooden boards with holes for their feet and stuff, and their hands were sometimes also restrained. We've seen this before. Usually people are like this. You go to a theme park, you pose with your family in one of these things, you're like, hey, I'm stuck. You're like, get me out, this is scary. They would be left in public spaces like that, such as the marketplace or town square, anywhere public because, why, of course, shame, we gotta shame everyone back then. And if that wasn't bad enough, the accused would then be pelted with food or even physically attacked by the crowd. Imagine that, imagine being so sparse for food and you're like, yeah, let's throw our bread at that guy. It's like, what a waste, we need that. The duration of the punishment, this varied, but it could range from a few hours to several days. Yeah, locked up like this for days at a time. What a joke. It was used for various crimes, theft, drunkenness, and slander, and it was intended to humiliate and shame the offender while also serving as a deterrent to others. Guys like, oh, I'd hate to be that guy over there. Yeah, for sure. All right, let's throw food at him now. Sick. So dumb. So dumb. Number 8, the drunkard's cloak. Yeah, this one's quite funny. Not really, but we'll see. The drunkard's cloak, also known as the barrel or the shaming cloak. Again, shame, big important step back there. This was a humiliating punishment used in medieval times for people who were drunk or disorderly in public. This drunk person, they were forced to wear a large barrel or a cloak made of wood or heavy cloth, something big and obvious with holes cut out for their heads and arms. Like they were a big mascot, a big barrel mascot in medieval times. And sometimes they would have offensive messages or images painted on it. You know what I mean? Like the piece of paper that says kick me. That was like the old school version of that, much worse. The person would then be paraded through town in this garment, this outfit, this big barrel and not fun, often with crowds throwing garbage or food at them. That kind of medieval Game of Thrones stuff. This punishment was intended to publicly shame the person as well. So yeah, shame, and then we'll go into the rough nitty-gritty stuff at the end here. Number 7, eavesdropping. Eavesdropping back in the day. I mean, today we've all done it, right? We've all listened at some point in our lives to somebody we don't know. Every time I hear somebody in our hallway, in our apartment, I have to look, right? I'm like, who is it? Someone breaking in? But if you did it during the dark ages, if you listened in on a conversation you weren't supposed to hear, well, there were some serious consequences that were waiting for you. Eavesdropping was considered a serious crime back then. That's why they're always whispering in Game of Thrones. Now it makes sense, right? The act of secretly listening in on someone's conversation without their knowledge and or consent, well, this crime was viewed as a breach of privacy and trust. How dare thee? It was often associated with other crimes such as treason or espionage. This was a big bad. Espionage? Are you kidding? Just because you heard someone say something? Get out of here. Punishments here could include fines, public humiliation, classic, imprisonment, or yeah, remember what happened to Littlefinger in Game of Thrones? Not great. There's worse stuff that could be done. Yikes. Horrible. Number 6, specific hunting. Yeah, you gotta be sure which, where you throw an arrow back then. In medieval England, the hunting of the king's deer was considered a very serious crime. Yeah, not that deer. That one's fine, but just don't you hit that one. The act of killing or even injuring a deer was punished harshly under the royal forest law, which was enforced by the king's foresters. That'd be a cool job, just rolling through the forest looking for people. The law applied only to the king's forests, which were areas of land set aside specifically for hunting for his food. Violators could be subjected to a variety of punishments, including fines, imprisonments, and even mutilation. Yeah, a little different than public humiliation. It's just mutilation this time. This law was meant to preserve the deer population for the king's personal use and enjoyment, and served as a way for the monarchy to maintain control over the forest and the resources that it provided. So if you want food, go to that forest over there. It's not even a forest, it's like a marsh. It's horrible. It's like 3 frogs left. Good luck. Number 5, heretic's fork. Yeah, a lot like this. This one sucked. The medieval heretic's fork was a device used during the Inquisition to punish individuals accused of heresy. You hear the wrong stuff and then you say the wrong stuff, no matter what you do, bad punishment awaits. Some forks going in a place you don't want it to be. This punishment consisted of a long metal fork with 2 prongs that were placed under the chin and the sternum of the accused, making it so you had to stay upright or else, yeah, not good. The device was designed to keep the person awake and prevent them from speaking and or swallowing, and if they do so, it would cause extreme pain. The prongs here could be adjusted to vary the amount of pressure applied, and the device was often left in place for hours or, again, like the other punishment, even days at a time, which is horrible. The heretic's fork was cruel, and it was a form of psychological punishment that was used to extract confessions and punish those who dared to speak out against the church. Yes, how dare thee? Now hold still. Number 4, sewer surfing. It's not as cool as you're imagining, but it's something along those lines. Also known as sewer hunting and or draining, sewer surfing was a popular but illegal activity during the Dark Ages and involved navigating through the underground sewage systems of cities, typically for thievery or other illicit activities, trying to find some gold, something, I don't know, something shady going on under the city. Sewer surfing was often punished severely, more than you'd think here. Guys going through garbage, they're like, hang him. It's like, what? It was also considered a violation of the law and a danger to public health. You go down there, you come back up with, I don't know, a plague that you found down there. You don't want that. You don't want a rat to bite you. Offenders would face fines, imprisonment, or even the gallows. However, despite the risks and penalties, many people continued to participate in this dangerous activity as it was their only means of survival or adventure, or money or goods or anything really. It led to numerous arrests and punishments throughout the medieval period. Honestly, fair. I don't know. You never know. Somebody may have lost a nice pocket watch, or maybe you'll find rats and then get really sick. 50-50. I found a pocket watch. Also, the town is violently ill, so I'm rich. Sorry. Number 3, blasphemy. Blasphemy! You almost have to yell it every time you say it, you know? Blasphemy was considered a serious crime in medieval times. It involved speaking ill or speaking contemptuously about God, Jesus, and or the church. That's a big no-no back then. Big no-no. This was seen as a direct attack to God and the faith. It was considered a threat to the very fabric of society just because you said some shit. Blasphemers could be punished in various ways. At this point, you probably know them. Imprisonment, flogging, and or, well, yeah, just you're dead now. In some cases, offenders were forced to wear a blasphemer's bridle, which was a metal mask with a spike that was inserted into the offender's mouth, which would, of course, prevent them from speaking more. Blasphemy laws varied across different regions and periods throughout medieval European history, but they all shared a common goal of protecting the sanity of religious beliefs and shoving metal into a human's mouth. All those things were very important to the faith. It's good stuff. Number 2, beard tax. I tried to grow a beard for like 2 weeks, and I just immediately bailed on the whole thing. I was like, hey, you'll see me, guys, I'll show you. And then I came back, didn't even talk about it. In medieval times, I would have been fine, honestly. It's a weird tax. There were periods and regions in medieval history where facial hair was regulated and or frowned upon. Imagine that, right? Guys trying to grow it out, has a little stubble. Everyone's like, ugh. Really, Alexander the 7th, really? During the reign of Henry VIII in England, a beard tax, cha-ching, was imposed to, well, only men with beards over 2 weeks old. They were required to pay. If you were day 13, they're like, all right, we'll see you tomorrow. You better figure this whole thing out, mister. Vikings, however, what about them? In the Dark Ages, Vikings, they were all about the beards. What happened? Beards, when it came to Vikings, they were highly valued and considered a sign of masculinity and strength. Again, I'd be screwed if it was that time. I'd be good over here, but then I'm a very weak man over here. Know what I mean? No tax and then no muscle. Taylor McWaters. No tax and no muscle. And finally, number 1, not reporting a dead body. Yeah, we've all seen Stand By Me. This can lead to some problems, some troublesome things. This last one here is pretty obvious in theory, but the way that they handled it back then was pretty crazy. We're not doing it the same today. Thank God. Thank the church and the lords. In medieval times, roughly around 1240, the law surrounding the discovery of a dead body, surprise, what's this? Who is this? This varied depending on the region and the time period. But generally, if somebody discovered a, who is this skeleton? What's this? Generally, at that time, they were required to report it to the courts or the lords. The lords, you know the lords, go tell the lords. Failure to do so could result in punishment, as of course, it was considered suspicious behavior. Fair, okay, fair. More often than not, the person who found the body, they would be asked to provide information about the circumstances surrounding the death, including any and all possible suspects. Yeah, so take a guess. He had wood teeth, he looked old and medieval, I don't know, he was someone. In some cases, the finder may have been entitled to a reward for discovering the body, but in other cases, you yourself could be charged with the death. So 50-50, might get some money, might go to jail. If that was me, I'd be like, nope, I didn't see a thing, sir. I was just looking up at space, wondering what that big rock in the sky is. I don't know what gravity is. All women are witches, right, brother? Cheers. Didn't see anything.
Alright, so you guys know my drill, so let's start off with the information most people may know a little bit more about already, such as dowries, which is a nice way for fathers to say, I will literally pay your family to get this chick out of my house. The arrangement of marriage was done by the bride and groom's parents. Royal or noblemen were sometimes able to choose their bride, but marriage back then was not based on love for the nobility. They were political arrangements. Husbands and wives were generally strangers until they first met, and if love was ever involved, it came after the couple had been married. But even if it didn't, most just sort of settled into a form of friendship or companionship, or just living with each other. The arrangement of marriage was based on monetary worth. Noble girls equal fatter stacks. Meanwhile, peasant dowries didn't really happen often, and when they did, they were paid in utilitarian means. The family of a girl who was to be married would give a dowry to the family of the boy she was to marry. After the marriage was arranged, the wedding notice was posted up on the doors of the church, and the notice was put up to ensure that there were no grounds for prohibiting the marriage by stating who was to be married and if anyone knew any reasons why they could not. But more on that in a little bit. Now, as mentioned, peasants were able to marry for love, but why make that choice? There was no marital benefits back then, because it's marriage or burn in damnation. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church essentially presented women with 2 life options in order to escape the sin of Eve. You could become celibate, which ultimately was the preferred choice, or to become married and mothers. You don't bathe, there's feces everywhere, there's the plague, and a man could just kill you tomorrow for rejecting him, and you want to add kids to that equation? When there's no medicine either? Pass. Hard pass. Nunneries were literal havens for these single women, because sure, you could be celibate and still live in town being a spinner or whatever, but again, you run the risk of some dude just jumping you and the courts blaming you for it and then doing something whack like cutting your nose off for it. Nunneries were female only. They kept things clean and locked up, so women could just try and have an ounce of peace in an era where existence was just to breed or feel bad about yourself. According to Halston C.S., once a girl was physically ready to consummate, aka she met Aunt Flo, she was ready for marriage. However, since puberty came earlier for females than males, they could marry at a younger age. So, for peasants who were genuinely interested in marriage out of love, something that could only be done consensually on both sides, they were eligible once they'd hit their respective puberties, and were able to wed. No parental consent required, which is the next on the list. As people lived short lives in the Middle Age period, parents of nobility often made arrangements early on, and a few months old baby could be betrothed to another few month old baby, and then raised in their respective royal nurseries until they hit that jolly old consummation age in their teens. Think Sleeping Beauty being promised to the prince in the Disney movie. Peasants and commoners, however, were able to marry as they wished, and parental consent wasn't even required. It was like this for centuries. But there's always those folks who didn't like when 2 separate religions mixed, and there's always those who tried to take advantage of the easy I do policy. So good things never last. And it didn't. When this law finally changed in England in the 18th century, the old rules still applied in Scotland, making towns just over the border such as Gretna Green a destination for English couples defying their family and wanting to marry without their consent. A brief personal story for you guys. So my mother is a traveler and decided to visit the famous Gretna Green town and wedding site, where the tradition of Gretna Green marriages still lives today. My mother was taking photos and reading history plaques when she got taken aside by her tour guide. A couple whose family wasn't supportive of their relationship, just like the couples of the past, had shown up and decided to marry spontaneously in the traditional way. They had chosen Gretna Green for its historical significance to their unsupported love, and they needed 2 witnesses. The tour guide could act as one witness, but they needed a second. So my mother stood as a witness for a young couple who had just traveled to the border to marry at Gretna Green alone, experiencing the same pilgrimage thousands of couples had done in history. So on the topic of witnesses, how did that get started? Up next is witness schmitness. In the Middle Ages, the household was headed by a husband and his wife was the center of the family life and economic productivity. As John Wells said in 1486, more things are necessary for a household than 4 naked thighs. And he used this retort upon hearing that his alleged betrothed, Alice Billingham, had publicly declared they were married. Instead of saying it straight, John was chastising Alice for suggesting they could legitimize their romantic relationship without the necessary social status and financial stability, not just intercourse. Alice, however, goes, nah, bro, I got the receipts, which were her witnesses to the fact that John had asked her to be his wife on the Feast of St. Valentine's that same year, which historically, yes, has always been a romance hallmark holiday, asking her for her hand so that she could be his Valentine forever. These 2 contrasting stories, however, give us a peephole into the tension between the expectation of love versus intercourse, and then the making of a good and economically fortuitous marriage in the Middle Ages. Alice says, you proposed to me with love, therefore that is our marriage basis. John says, I may have said I loved you, but I won't make a wife out of a... Well, you get it. So, while God was the ultimate witness, that's why couples could just say stuff like, be mine forever and become legally married. It's nice and all, but it was highly recommended to have witnesses to avoid uncertainty like the Alice and John situation. Because they didn't just sign your wedding doc back then, they stopped your husband from wandering off. I've done a lot of talk on the ins and outs of marriage, but how about kiss to be kissed, the medieval wedding ceremony itself? So, there was some errands to run leading up to the big day. First of all, long before the actual wedding, banns were called, which were literally 3 Sundays leading up. Someone stands outside the church and hollers that your wedding day is coming up. It's done so that people can come find out about the celebration and come along to the wedding. But also, those who had objections had the opportunity to voice them. They also put up signs on the church door with information, so if you're out just buying turnips one day and saw your husband's name and face on a poster, you could go up to the medieval lost and found and say, hey, yo, this one's mine. Wedding's off. A wedding ceremony could not be held on a Catholic holiday or on Sundays. A couple could not be married during a time of fasting. They can't be married by someone who had killed someone else. So make sure you got all those things written down to avoid. When weddings started to occur at churches, they were done at the front doors. Nobles married with big parades and elaborate garbs, while peasants sort of kicked it and whatever they had. The couple would exchange vows, usually some Jesus-y stuff, and the priests asked one last time if anybody's got any beef with these 2 getting hitched. After that, the groom presented his bride with the wedding ring, burlesque by the priest, and the ring was placed on each finger of the bride before landing on the ring finger, and amen, the ring stays there. Then the procession goes into the church, a special mass began, and people prayed for the couple and their future offspring. After the mass, the priest kissed the groom on both cheeks, and finally, the groom would kiss the bride. But sometimes you can say I do and have a whole ceremony and still have to prove it. In the Middle Ages, getting married was easy for Christians living in Western Europe. According to the church, which created and enforced marriage law, couples didn't need permission of their families or priests to officiate until towards the end of the 18th century. And though the church controlled or tried to control marriage, couples didn't need to marry in a church until the 18th century. So, medieval legal records show people getting married on the road, down at the pub, at a friend's house, in bed, really anywhere. All that was required for a valid binding marriage was the consent of the 2 people involved. So, while tying the knot can take a matter of moments, proving you were married
is a different story. The vast majority of marriage cases that came up before the courts were to enforce or prove that a marriage had been taken place in the first place. And marriage mix-ups bothered the clergy since, after much debate, theologians decided in the 12th century that marriage was a holy sacrament. The union of man and woman in marriage and intercourse represented the union of Christ in the church, and this was hardly symbolism to be taken lightly now. So they wrote up some laws and dished them out. The statutes issued by the English Church in 1217 to 1219 include warnings such as no man should place a ring of reeds or another material, vile or precious, on the young woman's hands in jest, so that he might more easily fornicate with them. Lest he thinks himself to be joking, he pledge himself to the burden of matrimony. Another thing in those statutes was hold that peace. Not your pee though, I know it sounded similar, but you can do that on the streets anywhere. It's medieval times. Beautiful. Anywho, the bonds I mentioned earlier were introduced as part of the 1215 changes to try and flush out any impediments before a marriage took place. This could be someone is already married, or she's not a virgin, or he's wanted for killing someone. There's range. Nevertheless, until the Reformation, there was no speak now or forever hold your peace. In the Middle Ages, problems discovered or revealed after marriage could have an enormous impact still. For example, Joan of Kent, who's remembered as Edward the Black Prince's wife and the mother of the future King Richard II, was married in her early teens. It was a whole Diana-level spectacle with full publicity, a church service, her new beau was an aristocrat, but after about 8 years of marriage, this marriage was overturned in the papal court, and she was returned to a knight she had secretly married without her family's knowledge or approval when she was 12. Imagine that, spend 8 years with a dude only to be shipped back to some idiot I said I love you to when you were 12. If that still happened nowadays, we'd all be locked in with our first crushes. Take a minute please and soak that horrible thought in. Anyways, it's difficult to know how many medieval people married for love or found love in their arranged marriage. There was certainly a distinction between free consent to marry and having a completely free choice. Now circling back to my earlier point where I explained the wedding day, how about the wedding night? Not a moment alone is next. Alright, y'all have officially tied the knot and locked lips for the first time. You did some praying, now it's time for a meal. Pretty normal stuff that lines up with nowadays. The peasant couple celebrated with their friends and family, drinking bridal ale for this special occasion and eating a meal traditionally made up of dishes brought by the wedding guests to help feed the community. That's right y'all, like a trailer park wedding, medieval receptions were potlucks. After the reception, a peasant couple may dance and enjoy their night, but a royal couple is ushered to the chamber to consummate the marriage in bed ASAP. The priest, the clergy, parents, really whoever wanted in on the action would come into the room, kick their feet up, and have some popcorn and tell the couple, give us a show here. The bride needed to be a virgin at the time too, which had to be proven by blood being on the bed sheets. If there wasn't any, the whole wedding could be undone on the spot, which actually would be really hard for those women who don't bleed their first times. They do exist. And of course, because there isn't enough people in the room while your cherry's getting popped as is, a medieval wedding tradition allowed unmarried guests from the procession to also follow royal newlyweds into the room and take turns throwing the bride and groom stockings at them. Whoever managed to make a direct hit would presumably get married soon. Yeah, this is where the bouquet toss comes from. Then someone has to go retrieve it off the naked sweaty couple so someone else can have a throw. Truly a magical time of wedding traditions. Imposed witnesses, parental consent, church weddings. Yes, it was because of the confusing I do issue and a bunch of others I've listed, but it was also because of kidnap. So, over the last 20 years, historians have increasingly problematized consent we've heard of in the past, warning us not to project modern understanding of consent onto that medieval canon law. Today, consent is defined by what is present instead of what is absent. Yes means yes instead of no means no. In medieval times, the gap between coercion and consent was essentially a hairline. Women didn't have many legal options to deal with very persuasive or dangerous men who demanded their hand and would stop at nothing to achieve it, and consequently, the women often agreed to marry them for fear of their life. Because stopping at nothing often led to being captured, and with women being property, if said captor managed to return home and take the woman against her will before a brother, father, knight, whoever can do something about it, she becomes his property. These abductions then regularly end in marriage because of the damage of the deflowering caused to the victim's reputation. She'd never be wanted by anyone else, and so the POS who can't understand the word no wins. To delineate between consent and coercion, canon laws dropped in the 1200s stated that the degree of pressure applied on an individual could not sway a constant man or woman, meaning that neither family members, romantic partner, a stranger, anyone
anyone could exert pressure on an individual to force their consent. However, the degree to which force is interpreted and is defined by each city or community. Some communities stay stuck in old ways. And last but never the least is apparently you can be too into your wife. So, marriage aside from being a means of property exchange was also used by the church to regulate adult activities and carnal desires of the everyday person. Because any intercourse outside of marriage was a universal sin, but intercourse in marriage is only acceptable for procreation. Which means the church is trying to peddle that a good intimacy relationship was beneficial to your marriage, but neither desire nor pleasure should be involved or play a role in it, because that's physically possible. They took this serious too, man. Like, Thomas Aquinas warned that a man who slept with his wife solely for pleasure was treating her like a lady of the night, and St. Jerome stated in the 4th century that a man who is too passionately in love with his wife is an adulterer. This is a sentiment which remained prevalent up until the end of the 16th century. Not only was the purpose of intercourse within marriage made abundantly clear by the church, and still is, but there were many rules and regulations pertaining to the act itself, like when the activity between the husband or wife was or wasn't permitted. That would be like a feast or fast day, Sundays, menstruation or pregnancy, while breastfeeding, and for 40 days after childbirth, also holidays, and holy days. This meant that on average, most married couples could legally have intercourse less than once a week. Negative 1 time a week, you guys. But at least we had champs like Albert the Great who would throw ladies the proverbial bone every now and then. He defended women's carnal desires during pregnancy, actually, in a document, claiming that the fetus stimulated desire in women. A woman never desires relations so much as she does when she is pregnant. Medicine is most needed in the time of greatest illness. That's a hell of a sentence, a lot to unpack there, so let's just leave it as medieval marriage sucked.